is your 2-minute warning. 2-minute warning. Okay, let's get this started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Your participation is much appreciated. I am Greg Falls. I am the board chair of Arizona Town Hall. Tara Jackson tells me that one of my jobs is to do things like this, so I am performing my job for a little while, and I will pass the board chair on to Darren Waschek this summer, so you get to see me for a little while longer. First, we have some sponsors, and I think we need to thank them. We appreciate things like this could not happen without them. The sponsors are the Thomas R. Brown Foundations, Leadership Now Arizona, and Vitalyst Health Foundation. And the sponsors today, especially of where you're sitting, are Gateway Community College and the Maricopa Community Colleges. So thank you to our sponsors. I'm guessing most of you are quite familiar with Arizona Town Hall. If you're not, we have been an organization since 1962 dedicated to building consensus on issues of importance to Arizona. I think we've been very successful at that. And one of the reasons was from the very beginning, we had a leader who was incredible, and that was Shirley Agnos. I remember when I first met her, I thought, this is a woman who knows every single person in the state of Arizona, and she almost did. I am sorry to report that I learned just a few minutes ago that she passed away last night. So I remember many good times with her, and we will miss her. But we move on, and move on we have. Let's talk about the program today. We are here as a capstone for our voting and elections in Arizona program that we did pretty much all of 2024. Community town halls all over the state, written materials, some of which you have in front of you. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, as we expected, there were things that Arizonans disagreed on related to voting and elections. Of course, we always do. But there were many, many things that we agreed on. And I think we accomplished a lot, educated a lot of people, and listened to a lot of people all over the state. And we are here to, I guess, celebrate that program, talk about it a little bit, before we move on to our next series, excuse me, series of community town halls. The agenda today, you have at your table there, is kind of broken up into what I view as 4 pieces. There's going to be a moderated discussion to start, maybe half hour, 45 minutes, followed by another moderated discussion. And then, as we do in true town hall fashion, we're going to let all of you talk among yourselves. And there are some discussion questions, and that will be a panel, essentially a panel discussion led by a facilitator and recorded by a recorder. So we should have some fun with that. And at the end of that, after lunch, we will have a brief Leadership Now Arizona program with 2 speakers. I don't know the details about that, but Tara Jackson does, and she told me that she will tell you about that before we enter into it. Okay? All right. I think with that, we are probably ready to move into our first moderated discussion. The moderator for that discussion will be Pat Norris. Pat Norris is a retired court of appeals judge, and probably does 100 other things, and I'm not going to try to describe all of them for you. She's a good person, and we really enjoy her at Town Hall. I'm going to let Pat introduce her panelists, and I'm going to turn the program over to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Greg should have said I'm a good person, and I would have said in response, but only some of the time. I'd like my panel to come on up, and I will try and save some time while they're joining me. We have a great panel today. I'm going to give them, however, short shrift, and basically say about 1 sentence about each of them, because you can read more about them in the materials you receive, and you should take a look at their biographical details, because we are really blessed to have 3 experts in many aspects of policy, planning, and elections. So on my immediate right is Robb, who's one of the most respected journalists in politics and public policy, not just in this state, but frankly in the United States. Then next to Robert is Barry Aarons. I've known Barry a long time, and he is one of the most respected individuals who works with businesses and individuals on crafting and presenting issues of public policy to policymakers. He's a very highly regarded and respected lobbyist. And for those of you who think lobbyists are not highly regarded and respected, you don't know Barry, because he really is that type. And then last but not least, next to Barry is Bill Gates. Bill just finished serving on the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, and during his just about 8 or 9 years on the board, served as chair at least a couple of times, and also was on the board during the really quiet and uneventful elections beginning in 2020. And Bill, along with his colleagues on the board, provided leadership and courage in dealing with all sorts of questions about the election. So. Bill is now the executive director of the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory and is a professor of practice at ASU's Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. So welcome to the Sun Devils. Thank you, Bill. Okay. So here's how we're going to handle this panel discussion. We have some questions that I'm going to tee up for the panel, and I'm going to call on them initially to get the discussion rolling. At your tables, you have cards or pieces of paper. And I would encourage you, as you're listening to the discussion, and if you have some questions or some observations, but especially questions, that, questions or statements that end with a question mark versus a period, then Tara will go around and gather them up and then give them to me. And as the panel is discussing the questions, I will sift through them and see if I can add your questions into the questions we've already prepared for today. So we do want to have this be as interactive as possible. So let's go ahead and then begin. Now I'm going to ask my first question to Robert as a journalist. So the question that we have that I wanted to ask you is from your perspective, Robert, as a journalist, what are the important things this audience needs to know about where are we today, not where we were 15 years ago, and not where we're going to be maybe in the future, but where are we today when it comes to voting and elections? And I'm going to ask you, based on where you see where we are right now, and I'm going to ask the other members of the panel to weigh in on that question. How did we get here? So where are we today, and how did we get here?
Thank you, Pat.
Now, you may need to turn that on.
Thank you, Pat. Where we are is after undergoing an extraordinary period in our election history, particularly here in Maricopa County, is thanks to the efforts of Bill, his colleagues on the Board of Supervisors, Recorder Stephen Richard, that we know that we have, for a human endeavor, a remarkably accurate, fair, and honest election system. And the debt we owe those people during this tumultuous period is incalculable. However, we also learned how fragile public confidence is in the integrity of our election system. And we were remarkably fortunate that we had a group of elected officials here in Maricopa County who were dedicated to chasing down and refuting in minute detail every accusation that was made impeaching the integrity and fairness of our elections. I do not have the confidence that we still have that inbuilt response system here in Maricopa County. I do think we have a critical mass on the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors who will want to continue to have a election system and that performs the duties that as a democratic polity we expect. So I don't think we're going to see the integrity of our election system challenged. However, I do believe that when it is challenged by outside forces, we won't have the same robust, detailed, unified reaction. So I think that creates a challenge for us as a democratic polity going forward. I think paradoxically, we're actually at a greater danger point now than we have been over the last 4 years. I regret to say that, but I think that there needs to be discussion of what do we do to create that robust response that I no longer think will automatically flow from the people who are responsible for managing our elections, particularly here in Maricopa County.
Let me call on Bill to follow up with that, and then Barry, I'll have you clean up.
Oh, yeah. As usual, first of all, thank you, Pat. And as usual, I absolutely agree with Bob. I pretty much every column he writes, I send him an email, say, I agree. So we are so fortunate to have him and his experience and his wisdom. I think that, you know, I used to, and by the way, I want to recognize my colleague, on the Board of Supervisors, Jack Sellers. Jack, it's great to see you. Thank you for your leadership. But, you know, this lack of trust in elections, I used to, I sit there and think about this, like, what is it about elections? Why is it that elections keeps getting attacked? But we're just one institution. I mean, the reality is all of our institutions are under attack, and people continue to lose trust in all of our institutions. So elections just happen to be a flashpoint here in Maricopa County over the past few years, but I have concerns about our institutions more generally, and we're seeing it right now with the federal workers, and the same sort of, as I've said in the last couple of days, it's like that fire hose of angst and vitriol that has been flowing towards election workers for the last 4 years has now been shifted to federal workers. So I'm very concerned about that. But I think with elections, I think Bob is right. I don't think you're going to see the same sort of defense of our elections, but there's a lot. One, our elections are in great shape. We have incredible leadership in Scott Jarrett and Ray Valenzuela. They're the ones who really run the elections. They're both still there. And the communications team, by the way, the recorder has, you may have read that this week, that the recorder got rid of his communications team. But on the board side, they still have their communications team. So there will be people pushing back. It's sad that this is what we have to think about in elections, as opposed to just how can we get more efficient? How can we provide a better experience for our voters? But unfortunately, we do have to focus on these things. And, if you look at the polling that was done after the 2024 election, there is some good news. There's a glimmer of good news that people now have much more confidence in the 2024 election results than they did on previous elections. But of course, is that just because of who won? So, we'll see how that turns out. So a little bit of hope, but for those of you in this room who care about our institutions, who care about elections, who care about elections workers, we thank you for all that you have done to defend our system, to defend those workers, and we ask that you not give up. And by the way, I want to be very clear. I'm all about questions. Jack and I and everyone else in America, we would answer any question. What I have a problem with is questions that have been answered over and over again, questions that are asked with a, intent of raising money or sowing more discontent. But the folks at Maricopa County and really elections offices and workers all across the country are incredible people. They do incredible work. They get paid nothing to do it. And we're so fortunate to have those people that we do all across this country. And they're still there. I was just with a bunch of them in San Diego yesterday. They're standing tall. they're proud, and they appreciate your support.
My turn. So I tend to agree with what Bob and Bill both said, and I've known these gentlemen. Bob and I were reminiscing how long we go back, and I didn't think I was that old, but I am. And I agree with what they said. I want to give you a little bit of a different take and why I am less pessimistic about the state of democracy and voting than some other people might be. I'm not saying that either of these two gentlemen were. But, you know, there's always accusations of fraud and a fix, right? I mean, weren't the Kansas City Chiefs supposed to win the Super Bowl this year because the refs were going to fix it, right? Pretty tough to do. I mean, there are good calls and there are bad calls and so on. But if you're a student of American history, you'll realize that there have been 6 elections since, including 1800, where there have been major accusations of voter fraud, major accusations that colored in several of the cases, I would contend, in several of the cases that colored the whole administration of the winner and affected the elections that followed. Right? 1800, you know, those of us who were around then will remember, you know, the Jefferson Adams. I mean, that was a bitter fight. And remember, in those days, newspapers were functions of political parties. They made no bones about the fact that they were going to be honest deliberators of the news. They were supporters of whoever happened to be paying their freight, so to speak. 1824, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. You want to talk about a bitter, where there were cases of literally fights and all kinds of mayhem that colored the 1828 election, because Adams won in 24 and Jackson came back in 28 and took it over. So a little bit of a commonality there if you want to think about it. 1876, Tilden and Hayes. I mean, Tilden walked in with enough votes. He just needed one of 2 states. Actually, only needed one more vote. One of 2 states. It was during Reconstruction, and lo and behold, some folks went down to make sure they protected voter integrity. And guess what? They woke up the next morning, Hayes had been elected. And that colored circumstances in the South for quite a long time. 1960, a lot of people gloss over the 1960 election. The greatest vote stealer in the history of America was Lyndon Baines Johnson. Par excellence. Anybody who've read the Caro books on Johnson, and if you haven't, I commend them to you. They're very well written. Knows that Johnson could steal anything that wasn't literally nailed down. And even then, he probably carried a crowbar with him. But if you think about it, I have a friend who some of you in the audience know, so I'm not going to name him, who was in law school in Michigan in 1960, was recruited by the Republican Party from Illinois to help on voter ballot security. And he actually has photographs of a voter roll next to a headstone with the name of somebody who had a very distinctive Polish last name and the same birth date. So there were accusations. And if any of you have read Nixon's 6 Crises, you'll know that he was given clear evidence, something we didn't have in 2020, but clear evidence in 1960 of elements like that in both Illinois and Texas, and said, what's the use? Why do it? I mean, to Nixon's credit, he decided not to challenge the election for the good of the country. And I think a lot of us, even with all of the negativity of Richard Nixon over the years and so on, he did the honorable thing. And then, of course, in 2000, you know, Bush v. Gore. I mean, there were accusations about the Florida election. It wound up in the Supreme Court and so on. And then, of course, 2020. My point here is this. American democracy allows for deep divisions. Not only does it allow for it, it revels in it. Now, the divisions today, I think, are exacerbated significantly by technology, meaning the 24-hour news cycle, because we can't just let things go. You know, I have 4 kids and 5 grandkids who are testament to that. Can't let things go. So I think it is going to be the next probably decade as we accommodate to how we are influenced by the new technology. I'm very happy, not endorsing who won and who lost, but I'm very happy that the 2024 election was not close, relatively speaking, at least in the battleground states. Why? Because it gave us a break. And I think, to Bill's point, I think people felt that. That's why they felt there was more integrity. And it was because there weren't accusations of fraud, because it wasn't close enough to make those accusations. So anyway, I'm not quite as pessimistic. I think these things are more anomalous. They're not anomalous. They're more cyclical than anomalous. So that's my take.
What we've heard from the panel is that leadership is stable and has basically implemented strong election procedures and policies, and that's not at risk. But that the support by the public is not nearly as robust. I think that's one message. And then, as Barry has said, we've had in our country's history a lot of divisions, and perhaps this is nothing new. Yet, for many people, it seems new. And indeed, many of the questions I've received so far suggest that. For example, if you look at some of the materials that we've distributed, the Center for the Future of Arizona did some significant and thorough polling in the last several months and found that vast majorities agree that convenient, accessible elections through measures like early voting and mail-in voting are a good way to go. About 70%, 79%, 75%, in the 70s, high 70s. Yet that still means we have 20, 25% of the population who thinks, no, we've got problems in our election system. Maybe 1 out of 4. That's pretty substantial division. So the question is, is there a way that we can cross that or narrow that division? And one of our attendees says, there seems to be different stories or narratives that create division. This is a good example. How do we address these narratives? Let's not call them stories, because that can be a pejorative term, but how do we address these narratives to try and narrow the division? Robert.
I would like to offer a distinction, at least in my mind, between accusations, historical accusations of voter fraud, and what we have just gone through, because I do think it's different. For much of our history, the system was vulnerable to voter fraud. And indeed, voter fraud occurred. You identified some of them. We have had the most thorough examination of the integrity of an election that's ever been conducted in Maricopa County in 2020. And yet large numbers of people, despite a indisputable factual evidence base, nevertheless believe that the results were fraudulent. That's different. I mean, we did not have voting machines. Voting machines weren't created until the late 1800s. So I do believe that what we are facing now is historically distinct and much more troublesome. I don't know what you could do more than what Bill and Jack and the Board of Supervisors and Recorder Richard did to chase down every single stray accusation of misconduct of an election and provide a thorough refutation of it. And I do believe that that created a barrier. It kept the suspicions about the elections from spreading beyond a base that was impenetrable to that kind of evidence. So I don't think it was a wasted effort. I think it, in fact, stemmed the tide of something that could have been far worse. I think that it's just a constant effort to confront these suspicions. Now, it may be that there are reforms that can take place that are under discussion that reduce the space for the conspiracy theories to take root and metastasize. I am indifferent as to whether we should cut off the ability to drop off early ballots on Friday. And then if you want to cast your early ballot on election day, that instead of just dropping it off, you have to show ID and you have to put it through the machine. I believe that that will result in fewer people voting. There are a certain number of people who will decide that that's more hassle than it's worth to them. However, I don't believe that it is an excessive restriction on the ability to vote. Even with it, the ability to vote in Arizona in the modern era will be as robust and expansive and varied as any place in the history of democracy. And it is certainly true that the lengthy period of time that it takes to verify the signatures on ballots, early ballots that are dropped off at election day, creates a period of time which is rife for the weaving of conspiracy, and I will say stories rather than narratives. Narratives is treating them too kindly. Now, this is headed for, the Republicans are going to vote it. Hobbs is going to veto it. And while I ordinarily am opposed to punting things to the voters in the form of a referendum, in this case, I think it might actually be the wisest course of action. I don't think there's a clear black and white preference, obvious advantage to one or the other. And it really is a trade-off between getting early results, which might build a little bit of more confidence in the system, versus some smaller voter turnout. And I do think that's something that maybe the body politic as a whole would be appropriate to decide.
On that point, I know that Bill has, better get to say, discuss this, because it seems like we're driven by, well, if we don't get an immediate account, then something's wrong in Denmark. You know, it's phony baloney. So Bill, what do you think? Since you've seen the issues with what they call late earlies, which are where people get early ballots in the mail, and then they wait to the very last moment to drop them off. It causes all sorts of verification havoc. So what's your thoughts?
So this has become the hot issue, right? This is how I guess we judge whether we've had a good election, is whether the results come out on election night. I'm not sure why it turned into that, but that has become it. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory is let's come to an agreement on what a good election looks like. Is that number one? Is speed the most important thing? I kind of think accuracy might be important. I kind of think voter participation rates, which by the way, have been over 80% in Arizona in 2020 and 2024. Those are things, I mean, these are historically high. These are things that we should be celebrating. So anyway, that's one of my pet projects right now. But having said that, I understand. I've been in the Jack and I were in the middle of the crosshairs on this in 2022, right? We had a particular candidate who alleged that we were, quote, slow rolling the results to, I'm not sure what, to what end, but we were doing that. This has now become a narrative. So I think that, you know, we certainly did at Maricopa County. There's only so much we can do, as Bob has laid out. This is really something that needs to be adjusted at the state level, but there were things that we could do. And in fact, we invested $6 million of your taxpayer dollars to get new high-speed tabulators. So between the 2022 and 2024 elections, we did that. We had, because of, you all remember that 2-page ballot that we had in 2024, because of that 2-page ballot, which by the way, was because the legislature had put so many referendum items on there. We tabulated nearly 4 million pieces of paper, 4 million, right? Just under 2 million voters. And we got it done in 10 days. And I know 10 days sounds like a long time, but it's the fastest we've done it in 2 decades and almost twice the number of pieces of paper. So we're doing what we can. At this point, the state, and again, if that's what the voters want, I think you're right, Bob. I think this is going to be decided by the voters. The lines have been drawn on this. But I would just say, let's think about what's important, what we really are focused on in our elections, and is speed really the most important thing? And if I can just address your original question briefly, this is something I thought about a lot, right? How do you get to those, whatever it is, 25 or 30% of the people who have just not listened to what we've had to say? They've not been moved, what we've had to say. And by the way, I would encourage you, if you haven't, to go to justthefacts.vote. That's a website that Maricopa County has been putting together since 2021, the Cyber Ninja audit started. And it goes through each one of these conspiracy theories and addresses it. So if you have, and I bet you all do, you have someone in your family who is part of that 25 to 30%, maybe encourage them to take a look at that, or, utilize that to help address their concerns. But how do we get to these folks? Well, we did an exercise in 2023. So we had Frank Luntz, the pollster, came out here. It was actually the day after the Super Bowl. And we had Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, Major Garrett from CBS News, a man by the name of David Becker, who's brilliant on election matters, and we spent 90 minutes, one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, 90 minutes with a focus group of folks who believed that the 2022 election was rigged in Arizona. And so we sat with them, and, Frank obviously did an incredible job of getting the folks to speak. And it was hard, but it was good. It was good to sit there and listen to these folks, what they were thinking. And at the end, one of the guys, his name was Chad, he came up to me and we started talking. And I said, "Hey, would you be willing to come with me, Chad? We'll go down to McTech. We'll go down to Maricopa County Tabulation. We'll take you around. We'll answer all your questions." He said, "Let's do it." So he came down with me and Scott Jarrett, our elections director, and we spent 2 hours with him. We answered his questions. We walked him around. And at the end, he said, "I'm convinced. I believe this." Now, unfortunately, we can't walk millions of people through McTech, but we've done more tours, in the last 2 years than we ever have before. And I think you've got to try, and we can't just say it's just too hard to do. I give up. There's too much at stake. And so that's one of the things that I'm thinking about. And if there are people in this room who have great ideas on how to do this, I'm all ears, because we've got to continue this effort. We cannot go forward with, perpetually 25, 30% of our people, of our voters, who do not believe in the system.
I'm a firm believer in the fact that people are very adaptive. I think if a bill passed, whether you're on the side of you believe that we should have those limitations or whether we shouldn't have, that they're suppressing the vote and so on, I think that we'd adapt to it inside of one election cycle. Why? Because the people who manage campaigns, not elections, but campaigns, would say, okay, this is what we're under now. Now we have to figure out how to get more votes than the other side under the new rules. We're very adaptive that way. I think we make much ado about nothing to try to protect the current existing situation, because that's what the people who manage campaigns are used to. And they believe that one side is trying to suppress the vote and the other side is trying to expand the vote, change the rules. The same things will happen, except people will adapt. I think that is really significant. Let me turn to the question that was asked a little bit. How many of you in this room believe that compromise is the most important factor in political discourse? Raise your hand. Come on, be honest about it. Compromise is the most important factor. Come on, raise them, keep them up. Unless you've got a problem with your arm, you got to put it down. All right. So I'm seeing almost everybody. So I've taught for the Leadership Institute for the last 25 years. We've stopped using the word compromise. You know why? Because compromise implies that you're giving up something to get something. That's what compromise is. Okay, Greg, I'll give up something so that I can get you to agree to something. We now focus on the word consensus. Let me tell you how that works. So I happen to represent one of my lobbying clients that I represent, the workers' comp attorneys. And we meet with the insurance companies every year in September, October. We have a wild, crazy yelling and screaming match about what we all want to do and don't want to do and so on. And then we go back to our clients, say, here's what their unicorns are. Here's what our unicorns are. What are we willing to do? What we'd like to do. And then we get back together in late November, early December, and we put things in 3 piles. One pile is over my dead body issues. We put those over here. One is, yeah, we all agree on this. We put this over here, and then we work the middle issues. And if we can achieve a consensus on those issues, we move forward with them. If we believe we will get to consensus, then we'll continue to negotiate through the legislative session. And we have wound up, at least in my experience over the last 7 to 10 years, we've never had either group saying that they got rolled over or they lost. And that's what trying to develop consensus is. And I really believe that in our political discourse, if we think about things in those terms, here's the job opening, here's the over my dead body issues, we're just going to sweep them away. We're not even going to deal with them. All right. And here's the issues that we can all agree on. Oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's go with that. And then the ones in the middle you work on to develop a consensus, not to compromise, because you don't want to force somebody to give something up. The more you force compromise, the longer it lingers in their mind that, oh, I had to give this up last year. I don't want to have to do that again. The last thing I would say, and this is part of it, and I know when we were having a conversation in the development committee, was it last Friday, Tara? And I rose the issue that today we've got a conflict between human relationships and political relationships. And that sometimes political relationships overwhelm us and actually sweep over the human relationships that we have. How many people have heard of somebody who says, well, I can't have Uncle Harry at dinner for Thanksgiving because he's going to say crazy stuff. And then we're going to get yelling and screaming. We're going to start throwing potato salad at each other, and it's going to ruin the dinner and so on and so on. And that's because political relationships have overwhelmed some human relationships. And I think we have to reconnect some of those. And the way to do it is to strive for consensus rather than to force compromise. Just a thought.
Barry, thank you very much. Let's stay with that point about consensus. Again, the Center for the Future of Arizona, as I mentioned, did some extensive surveying a few months ago. And one of their takeaways was that, and I quote, only 43% of Arizonans believe leaders are talking about the issues that matter most to them. And most Arizonans do not believe their leaders work across party lines, represent diverse voices, or focus on the future, working across party lines, not focusing on consensus. We had some initiatives on the ballot this year, for example, on open primaries. And one of the attendees today said, open primaries got shot down nationwide. Will the needle move on this ever in this state, anywhere else? Another attendee in a similar vein said, is there still a Republican Party, or is it traditional Republican and then the MAGA Party? So the question I have here is that the structure of our elections, the structure as it currently stands, is that a structure that will just maintain the status quo? Should it be changed? Open primaries was shot down. If that was the answer, why did it lose? Is there a different structure that we should consider? So, yeah, go ahead, Barry.
2 comments. First of all, we had lieutenant governor on the ballot for about 4 different times in history. It never got more than 30%. This year it passed overwhelmingly. I don't know why. How many of you folks would like to run for lieutenant governor? I don't see a single hand raised in this room. Okay. How many of you think you'd be a terrific lieutenant governor? Raise your hand. Okay, I see one hand in the back from a very self-abased human being who would like to promote campaign, and we'd be more than happy to get you hooked up with a campaign manager, right, Chuck? Chuck there. I think things, I think things kind of rotate around. And will we ever get an open primary? Yeah, I think we will. I think the circumstances will. This was a good one, but the reason that it didn't pass this year, I'm convinced, is because it got bogged down in all kinds of crazy lawsuits and so on. And nobody had a chance to really focus on the benefits of open primaries. And Chuck knows I supported that. I liked it. I may not like ranked choice voting. I might prefer just straight jungle primary. But the fact of the matter is, I think people got bogged down in listening to all the debates about whether there were enough signatures or not, so on and so forth, and never broke through to the real issue. So I think that, again, things are cyclical, and things that don't sound like a good idea turn out to be a good idea afterwards. And is there a Republican Party? Yes. Who was the most progressive president in the history of America? Anybody want to take a guess? Say again? Teddy Roosevelt. That's exactly correct. He was a Republican. He was the most progressive president in history, especially measured against that time. All right. A lot of things he believed in those days, you'd never get a Republican to support right now. And a lot of that, I could give more examples. But the fact of the matter is, as I said before, American history is cyclical, and alliances change. And what is the Republican Party going to look like post Donald Trump? I don't know, but it'll still be there. I just don't know what it'll look like. Who should I pass the baton to?
I don't have a very long answer. Jack and I both ran under a top 2 primary or top 2 election in Chandler and Phoenix, and it works out pretty well. And I think, if there's another effort made, maybe, focusing on that a little bit, simplifying it. But in 2024, in the presidential election in Arizona, of the Gen Z voters who voted, 47% were independent. So this is coming. I mean, the independents are going to have even more and more influence, but they're cut out. They're cut out in a lot of ways. Yeah, you can reach out and get a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot, but how many people do that? I think the reality of the influence of independents is going to push this forward. I don't know when it's going to be. Don't know what that year it will be, but in my opinion, it needs to be very simple. Just top 2. And I think we will start to, it's not going to be a panacea, but I think it will start to impact those people who are elected to office in Arizona.
I do believe that there were atmospherics that didn't give Prop 140 a fair shot. But with apologies to Chuck, I also believe it had a fatal design flaw, which is it left how the general election was going to be conducted unresolved up to the legislature. And if the legislature doesn't act, invested the authority in a single individual, the Secretary of State. I also think that ranked choice voting just isn't suited for Arizona. We elect too many people on a single ballot to ask people to, instead of making 13 distinct choices as to who you want in a general election to actually hold the office, to rank order over 50 candidates vying for those same offices. I've been an advocate of a truly nonpartisan top 2 system for some time. And it is, I think, more saleable to the body politic because it resembles what you're used to. Just gets rid of the disproportionate influence of partisans in a partisan primary system. And in addition to the growing number of Arizonans who decline to affiliate with either of the political parties, there is even beyond that dissatisfaction with the choices that are being offered in terms of general election candidates by the two political parties. There's large numbers of Democrats and Republicans who don't like the options the primary party system is tossing up. If you look nationally, in the 17 elections that have taken place since, including 1992, there has been, the American electorate has voted for divided government 10 times. Of the 6 times prior to the most recent one, that unified government was provided, in one party held the presidency in both houses of Congress. The voters, in just 2 years later, decided to give the opposition party control of one of the bodies of the Congress 5 out of 6 times. The longest period of time that we've had since 1992 of having unified government was 4 years under George W. Bush. And the very next election cycle, the voters gave Bush both a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. So we have this endless toggling by swing voters between the two parties because of deep dissatisfaction with the choices the two parties are yielding. And particularly in Arizona, it doesn't fit our political demography, and I don't think it can last forever. I do believe that there is a need to be able to have to make this a big issue on the ballot. And both because of the delayed start of the pro-campaign, because of the lawsuits, but also because we had a presidential election, and Arizona is now a battleground state. We had a contested US Senate race. There just wasn't much ability for there to be this issue to rise to a position of importance to voters. And there were over 200,000 Arizonans who voted for president or US Senate who did not vote in Prop 140. So like Bill, I think it's inevitable. I don't know what the right time is to push for it, but I think a system that presents such dissatisfying choices cannot long last. One last observation. Arizona is often called a purple state. I don't think we're a purple state. I think we're a red state that gets purple results because of the kind of candidates that the Republicans are putting up. Where Arizona is we're center right. But a center right candidate today does not have a path to the general election ballot. I don't think that's a circumstance that can long be sustained.
We have basically on about maybe a minute or two. I have a watch, it's only my watch that matters, yours doesn't matter. So, okay, so be real clear about that. The point you have made, Robert, is an excellent point. Do you perceive, and I'll ask, and this question for the other two members of the panel, a difference between the point you've just made between rural Arizona, I mean, true rural. Yuma is not rural, despite what some people say. It really isn't anymore. Nor is Flagstaff, folks, or Prescott. Surrounded by rural Arizona, yes, they are. But anyway, do you see a difference in the approach here with independents and others between rural and urban Arizona? Structures we've been discussing.
When I started lobbying, started involved in the legislature in 1971, all the quote unquote rural legislators were Democrats. Every single one of them was Democrats. And all of the urban, were Republicans, especially in Tucson. I mean, I could list you out people like Doug Holtzclaw and so on who were solid Republicans and so on in Tucson. You have to look really hard to find a Republican out of Tucson right now. And you have to look really hard to find a Democrat in a lot of what is considered rural Arizona. I come back to my thought from earlier. Things are cyclical. I agree with Bob in terms of what the Republican Party. I think to some extent the Democratic Party also is providing, given the current structure of our elections. But I think it's cyclical, and I think it varies, and I think it's circumstantial. And I think that the issues that confront every Arizonan that they're really concerned about are not the issues that the extremes of the two parties are interested in.
So I probably shouldn't answer this question since I was on the board of supervisors for the great state of Maricopa. But as everyone else loves to call us, but I think it's a great question, Pat. And I think that this is something that people who are running for statewide office need to think about a lot more. I mean, there is really a gulf between Maricopa and Pima to some extent and the rest of the state, right? The economic opportunities, the economic growth that we have here, it's simply lacking in most of the rest of the state. And I think we need to focus on that. We're one state. And what can we do to create the sort of dynamism in the 13 other counties that we've seen in Maricopa and Pima, I think is extremely important. But people need to start talking about that because we are unique. And by the way, that's it's a whole nother discussion about why this whole election thing became such a big deal in Maricopa is because we're over 60% of the voters of the state. That is unique. And, again, people who run campaigns know that, right? And that's where they put the focus. And this is where they can raise money and this is where they can get votes. But we've got to look at the entire state.
Robert, last word.
I would broaden the discussion from independents to swing voters. And that includes independents. It includes disaffected Republicans. It includes disaffected Democrats. And beginning with the 2018 election, they now are who decides the outcome in statewide elections. In 2018, there were roughly 225,000 Arizona voters who voted for Republican Doug Ducey for governor and Democrat Kristen Sinema for U.S. Senate. In 2024, Arizona voted for Donald Trump for president and Ruben Gallego for U.S. Senate. You can't get very further apart than those two choices. And that swing voter doesn't come exclusively out of Maricopa County. Maricopa County's results are a significant part of that, but still far less than a majority, and maybe only about 20 or 25%. So this disaffected swing voter who's not satisfied with the choices that the status quo is throwing up is broadly across the entire state. And you may see it in the rural counties in a difference of the extent to which a Republican wins a vote or the extent to which a Democrat wins the vote. But I believe that it is spread out throughout the state and focusing on just the people who formally decide that they're independent, I think understates the strength of what is the true independent vote in Arizona.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's applaud. Very much.
Thank you, Pat. Panel, that was a fantastic discussion. I happen to be one of those people that believes that essentially everything can be improved. And by way of example, I point to the Kansas City Chiefs. They almost never lose, but they recently lost when it mattered most. I don't know enough about football to tell you what they need to do to improve, so I'm not even going to try. But we do have a moderated panel here who is going to tell us what are some key issues and opportunities for improving elections in Arizona. The moderator is Evelyn Casuga, And Evelyn is the Director of Community and Economic Prosperity for the Center for the Future of Arizona. But most importantly, from my perspective, Evelyn is my immediate predecessor as chair of Arizona Town Hall, and I am still trying to fill her shoes. So welcome, Evelyn. I will let you introduce your panel, and this should be a good discussion. Thank you.
Oh, Greg, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for the previous panel who laid out some interesting topics that we're going to get a little deeper into through this panel and then through your conversation right after this panel. So hopefully we are feeding you lots of food for thought. And that's the intent of the way the program is structured. So although the topic is key issues and opportunities for improving elections in Arizona, but more broadly, we're actually exploring civic health in our state. And I think you will hear that from our very esteemed panelists this morning. And I'm not going to read their bios. As Pat mentioned, you have your bios at your table, and please take a good look at them. But allow me to highlight, however, what isn't covered in their bios is that the many miles and meetings that they've all traveled across and around Arizona, city council chambers, community centers, classrooms. We've all done it many, many times for many, many years. And not only on civic health, but on criminal justice and mental health, special needs populations, water and energy, and many, many more topics over the many years. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Arizona Town Hall and Center for the Future of Arizona and Vitalyst, we are ever present in all of your communities in one way, shape, or form. So their comments today are grounded in community-based interactions, research, and collaborations with a multitude of stakeholders, and I know many of you are here today. So let us go ahead and dive in. So David, you get the first shot. David, who is the Director of Strategic Community Partnerships with Vitalyst Health Foundation. What role does civic engagement play in individual community health, and why should we all care about having a voting and election system that is trusted?
Thank you so much, my friend. Thank you all so much for joining us and strengthening civic health in Arizona by being here, by participating. As you'll learn in just a few as we dive into this topic even further, by simply showing up to a town hall, you are strengthening civic health in Arizona, which is especially awesome because happy Arizona Statehood Day. It's my favorite holiday tomorrow, right? Besides Galentine's Day, which is also today. So, but yeah, Evelyn, thank you so much. You know, I am so proud to be able to work at Vitalyst Health Foundation, directing our civic health portfolio, because we are part of a growing movement and a growing body of research that is making this connection that the more civic participation there is in a community, the more civically engaged our residents, our communities are, the healthier those communities are, the healthier policy outcomes that we're able to achieve. So if you take a look in our Spark report, Strengthening Civic Health in Arizona, you can get a glimpse of that growing body of research that has been facilitated by a great national network of public health officials led through the Healthy People, Healthy Democracy Initiative. And they do, there's a set of public health indicators that measure a person and a community's health, and they match that with inclusive voting policies to be able to drive this concept. It's also a concept that might seem weird for a health foundation to be working on. Why, at Vitalyst Health Foundation, are we interested in how people are engaged and connected in their community? It's because of this connection to health. We understand that there are certainly very important aspects to a healthy community. For those of you who don't know, Vitalyst Health Foundation works on a variety of the broader social determinants of health, but we of course have priority areas around healthcare integration, ensuring folks have access to care, and also things like housing, because we know how important that is for a person's ability to live a healthy life. But as a health foundation, as I mentioned, we look at the broader social determinants of health, one of which is this concept of social and cultural cohesion, which includes civic engagement. So in this concept of civic health, which we use as a term, we mean how a community comes together every day to tackle their toughest challenges. In our case, as a health foundation, how they're working to improve the health of themselves, their family, their community, ultimately our state, our country, and we think our democracy. So it really is this correlation, and we're not alone. There is a growing movement, as I mentioned, every decade, our country sets out a 10-year health strategic plan, essentially, through our Department of Health and Human Services. This decade, it's called Healthy People 2030. And for the first time, the federal government has elevated the concept of civic engagement, civic health, including voting, from a research objective to a core objective in that health strategic plan. That means that the federal government is saying that being engaged in your community, including voting, has positive health outcomes. And with that, pretty much every health industry association, the American Medical Association, the American Public Health Association, the National Association of City and County Health Officials have all endorsed this concept and have outlined greater research due in this area and greater strategies to inspire more Americans to become involved in their communities and including voting. I love in this Healthy People 2030 framing, the Rear Admiral that oversees the strategy, he likens it to this kind of healthcare integration model. So to build our physical health, we go to the gym, right? Or if you're in Arizona, you take a beautiful hike, go for a walk, you flex your muscles, right? That's how you strengthen your physical health. For your mental health, you might also go on a hike or pet your dog or talk to a friend or see a therapist. That's how you flex your that's how you strengthen your mental health and flex that muscle. But how do we flex our civic muscle? How do we strengthen our civic health? Those three are so critically important when you're looking at the totality and the integration of healthcare and being able to live a healthy life. So we see civic health as, again, that broader sense of how anybody can come together, and we see this every day to tackle their toughest challenges, improve the health of themselves, their families, and their communities. So that can look like a lot of different things. Voting is certainly one of those, but we see it as more broad ways of connecting in your community, including volunteering, giving to your favorite local nonprofit. Arizona Gives Day is coming up. Letting your voice be heard at a city or town hall, or through this deliberative democracy concept as well. There are boycotting or boycotting. There are a variety of ways, and in this report, you'll see a spectrum that shows all the ways that encompass civic health. So that is the role that we see civic engagement playing in health, and why I'm an evangelist for this concept, and so glad to be able to be here and partner with my panelist.
All right, David, thank you. And because he's starting the conversation, there are probably some questions that you all may have as we're going along. So just as the last panel, you do have the opportunity to fill out a question card, and there will be folks to collect them and bring them up to us. So thank you, David, for setting us off. So Christy, my dear friend, colleague at Center for the Future of Arizona, and Christy is the Director of Health, Civic Health Initiatives. Here's your question. What are trends that you can share on civic engagement and voting on elections in Arizona? And what are some of the main narratives? And I think we heard some of the data during the previous panel as well. So Christy, you're on.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Evelyn. I'm so excited to be here today. And I'll start just by sharing what brings Center for the Future of Arizona to this conversation. We have a longstanding commitment to strengthening civic health in Arizona that's really driven by a shared vision of success called the Arizona We Want. So informed by decades of survey research and community engagement and close listening to Arizonans, really understanding what are the issues that matter most to Arizonans and what are our shared public values. And one of those shared public values that was brought up in the earlier discussion is this idea that Arizonans really do want greater civic engagement that solves problems, to David's point, and a democracy that's really working for all of us. That has come through loud and clear in our research and engagement over the years. Some of the data that was brought up in the earlier panel showing that there's really strong, wide consensus around wanting elections and voting that's accessible and convenient and really representative of all of Arizonans' voices, that we have a strong hunger for greater civic education. 76% of Arizonans really want to see civic education as a priority in K-12 schools. So we know that's one of the main narratives, is that Arizonans really have this hunger and shared desire for greater engagement. Alongside that, I think we've also seen that there's a really deep concern. So some of the data that was shared earlier around concern in our leadership, that less than a third of Arizonans really believe we have leaders who can get us through tough times, that we have leaders who represent diverse voices. As recently as this fall with the Arizona Voters Agenda, we had 91% of Arizonans expressing concern about divisiveness and partisanship in our political system. So we know that there's a lot of work to be done. And part of what we know then is, well, how are Arizonans showing up in our communities and in civic and public life? And we do that through the civic health progress meters, data that we're able to track of looking at what are kind of these building blocks, to David's point, of the ways that folks show up in community every day. And there are some concerns in that arena too. So we don't have the 2024 data just yet, but looking at 2022 in our elections, nearly 1 in 4 non-voters said they didn't vote because they felt their voice or their vote wouldn't matter. So when you think about sort of the net number of potential voters that are on the sidelines because they think that it won't matter, that for us really illustrates that connection between the erosion of trust that was spoken about earlier, lack of faith in institutions, potentially fueling sort of disengagement. So how do we start to reverse that cycle of really building trust, encouraging engagement, and getting more into that virtuous cycle instead? And then the last data, just to share on that note, David really spoke about this starting at the community level and the neighborhood level and kind of person to person. And we know for Arizona that some of our measures of how we work together in our local communities, whether we're talking with our neighbors, we actually rank in some of the bottom levels among other states in those areas. So it's an issue of concern, and it's something that then, of course, has implications for polarization, how we're getting our information, whether or not folks are engaging in the political system. So I know we'll talk about solutions today and some of the work ahead, but that data for us helps kind of present a path that these are multifaceted issues sort of beyond voting in elections that require then solutions that are really tending to all of those levels. But it also, for me, points to there's a real urgency and hunger for action. So with that level of desire for change and that level of concern right now, that presents actually potentially a great catalyst to move forward as a state.
Talk about catalyst, all of you being here, plus we have a number of people online if you didn't know that. And so hopefully we are definitely sparking some ideas about what you can bring home. So keep that in mind. So Tara, Arizona Town Hall had this voting and elections topic last year, over 1,000 people or so that you heard from all over the state, rural, urban, wherever, communities of interest. So what were the takeaways from that year on voting and elections?
It was quite a year. Can you all hear me, Hassan? Great. I just want to highlight real quick, if you haven't already looked at it in person or if you're online, our highlights report. This is like the summary of over 35 programs on this topic around the state, every corner of the state, every demographic that you can imagine. I'm going to give some of my key takeaways from that and some things that you don't see in the dry reporting, if you will. But first, I want to give a little perspective, especially with what we just learned this morning, that my predecessor and mentor, Shirley Agnos, passed away last night. It was about, if you're just joining us, yes, we just learned that. It was about 31 years ago that she asked me to attend my first statewide town hall as a recorder. And Shirley, by the way, is self-described conservative Republican. Keep that in mind as we honor her today and we look at the future of our state and our nation. And when I came to that statewide town hall, what I learned as, at the time, a trial attorney, is that this was a much better way to solve problems. instead of pitting each other against each other, that there was this method and process homegrown in Arizona that could bring diverse people together, that could come up with the best solution to move us forward. And that's why when about 19 years ago now, hard to believe it's been that long, when she asked me to step into her very big shoes, I decided to do a pay it forward moment, because this process in bringing our communities, our state, and our nation together, and even as a leader in the world, is so critical. And so this year, I will tell you that the town hall process, which has been tested repeatedly over the years, has been tested in ways that some of you who have been with me, we wondered, will we get through this? Will people be at their throats at the end of this program? It has survived every single time. It has never been more tested than this past year. And I think that's important for us all to think about. This is a pivotal year. This is a pivotal topic, and Arizona's at the center of it. We can either be leaders moving forward with a solution that brings us together, and we can show other states how to do it, or we can go with that narrative or story, whatever you want to call it, that divides us and polarizes us. I, for one, am about how do we bring all of us together. And so with that, and that gives you a little bit of overview, first a high level overview. You know, some of these programs that you'll see that I was at, almost all of them were self-described, mostly Democrats, but I will tell you those were very few. Most of the programs were self-described Republicans, and some were, I have now termed, there really are like a MAGA group and a Republican group, at least what I experienced. And it's unfortunate that we have picked categories that we feel we must fit in, and that then we go to othering and dividing, because that is not what's going to work for us moving forward. So first, some other high-level things. Number one, to remember that this process that's been around for over 60 years was most sorely tested this year. What does that say? Barry, I hope it's cyclical, but I hope it's not cyclical of an internal civil war where we are against our family and our neighbors. We can all stop that. That's the good news. Other things that I saw, I want to get back to the, whether, you know, in Judge Norris's terms, narratives, or Robert's term, story. Here's what I came away with that I was really perplexed with. I felt like there were different stories in different universes, depending, right, on whether I was in Lake Havasu City or Tucson or Sierra Vista. It felt like it was a completely different world. And these are smart, intelligent civic leaders. How is this happening in our state? And how is this happening in a way that keeps dividing us and keeping good people from wanting to run for or hold office? That is something that we can all tackle. And my answer in long drives around the state is that it is about this story or narrative. And here's what I would encourage you to do if you wonder about that. I know for us at our home, we have a channel we like to watch where you can see 6 news outlets at the same time. It is fascinating to watch because you would think you were living in different universes. And as civic leaders, that's the first thing I would tell you. Broaden your news outlet, broaden your stories, broaden the people who you talk to. And instead of coming from a place of contempt or condensation, condescending versus condensation, that's slightly different. That's for a water town hall. Come from a place of asking questions, seeking to understand, and bonding in a way that maybe is on another issue, because that is the only way that we will get through this. If you're one of the many people out there, whether online or in person, who was changed by Shirley Agnos's legacy, this is your time to honor that legacy. This is your time to honor her by reaching out to someone who you may think you have nothing in common with, and to find where you can build that leadership together for our communities, our state, and our nation, because that is what comes out of every Arizona town hall gathering. So what are some of the stories that I heard out there? I'm going to start with the more challenging ones first, and I want to end at least my part of the presentation with where there's an awful lot of hope. I saw a lot of distrust in our election system. And let's see, where did Bill go? He may have had to step out. Is he still here? A lot of concerns about distrust that didn't seem to be warranted if people actually went and watched the system itself. So where is this story of distrust being planted, and is it valid? We all want fair and free and trustworthy elections, right? We all want that. So what do we do to ensure that we have that, and that wrong stories are not being perpetuated, and that we are not perpetuating those wrong stories? So that's one thing that I think on sort of a negative side we need to address, a challenge. Another big overall challenge I saw that you won't see in the reports is a lack of courage. You know where I'm going, Sarah. When we took on this topic, there were organizations, civic organizations, leadership organizations, businesses, and communities who were too afraid to even have a discussion in an incredibly important election year, a discussion being facilitated by an organization that's known for facilitating nonpartisan or multi-partisan discussions. We need to reach deep in and have the courage to do what is right. And there have been some very courageous people, many in this room, who have faced backlash, personal threats to themselves and their families simply for asking questions and helping to create these discussions. So I want to give, first of all, a shout out and a thanks to the many organizations who partnered with us to host these conversations, some of whom were afraid to have them, especially in rural Arizona, very conservative or MAGA country. Like, how do we know? There was more distrust there. How do we know you're really going to listen to our voice and record it? I will tell you that after that first discussion question, when we reported out what they said, trust was gained almost immediately, because that's what we do at Arizona Town Hall. We report out what you say, whether we personally agree with it or not. And that itself has value, just listening. And so, you know, not only a shout out and a thanks to all the organizations, including the many chambers of commerce who joined us for the first time to host these conversations, but a shout out to our sponsors, because we also had a lot of companies who said, I think I'll skip this year. That's kind of a touchy topic. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the Arizona Town Hall Board, who said, even if we go in the red, we're going to do these conversations around the state, because that's the courage that we need to have as leaders. So on to some other things. What did we find as far as structurally? You'll see it in here. What are some ways that we can make a difference? There was incredibly broad consensus, regardless of where I was at, that there needs to be better education, civics education, not only in our K through 12 system, which is overburdened. So how do we help them with that? But also as adults, continuing education. I can't tell you how many people with law degrees did not know about primary elections, and that as an independent, they can choose which election to vote in.
Yeah.
And you heard, right? You heard in our opening presentation how many people are now registered independents. How do we make sure that people know what their rights are with voting so that we can truly represent what's best for Arizona? And on that note, and thanks to Vitalyst for helping us publish this, and for Pat Norris and some other town hall folks for helping us put it together, the Spark report, Why Primaries Matter and What to Do About It. If you're wondering why primaries matter and how we can change the system, there's a lot of description of that in this report that you might want to inform yourself about. One of the other items that frankly was a real surprise to me at first, as a lawyer, as someone with 2 children in the military, and that was this, that people questioned whether democracy was a good thing. This was not a few people. So there is a narrative that I found. In some places, it was the overwhelming narrative that democracy is a bad thing. Is that the narrative or the story that we want? Do we really think that's what's best for our communities? So we need to look at that. But overwhelmingly, people said democracy is a good thing and we need to protect it. But that small voice was a very vocal voice. The other aspect that you won't see in the report, and then I'll pass it on for the next question, is the incredible emotion in some of these conversations. Emotions that were based on, I'm going to go back to stories or narratives, where there was no ability to have a rational conversation about facts. How many of you encountered that? You might even be that way yourself sometimes, because it tends to come from fear, except for Pat. So there was incredible emotion. And in my 19 years as president of Town Hall, the closest I've come to this is when we did a statewide town hall on criminal justice, where I felt like my secondary role was group therapist, calming everyone down. Well, all of those roles were in high gear, and even 1,000 times this year in some of the different conversations. So I think as we move on to the next question, and as you think about when we have audience discussion, what can you do? It can come down to some of those individual conversations, you reaching out to people in a way where you don't have to agree with them, but answer open-ended questions, seeking to understand, making those bonds again with those family members and friends who may have different political labels after their names, because that is incredibly important and critical at this stage. And that's one thing we can all do.
Wow, you got us all warmed up here, the three of them. So because the questions may get answered in this next one, as in where do we go from here? So for each of you, where are the greatest opportunities to bring our communities, our state, and our nation together in a constructive way? And of course, considering policy changes, narratives and stories that need to be cultivated that may be different than what's out there now, and actions to bring different community members together. And I know there's a lot of folks in here and probably online from all over the state of Arizona. So this applies to all of us. So David, you want to get started with that one?
Sure thing. Yeah. I feel in my role at Vitalyst, I have the greatest job because I get to meet very passionate Arizonans every day who are doing the most with the least. And you all are probably in the room right now. There are just awesome things happening around our great state, around our country, that if you just turn off your TV or the 6 news channels and whatnot, and just kind of connect with your community, you'll see great things happening. In my role, in addition to overseeing our civic health portfolio, I direct our grants program. So we have these conversations every day with folks that are very passionate about their work to improve the health of their neighbors and their community. And as I mentioned, it ultimately goes up to our state and our country, and I think our democracy. And in our role at Vitalyst, you know, as a grant maker, we try to leverage funding to support those people that are coming together in coalition to make systemic change. And it's awesome. So there are great examples I'm sure you're aware of that are happening across the state. I mean, there's, as we know, there are difficult challenges that we're experiencing as a society. And certainly here in Arizona, a lot of the topics that have been covered by Town Hall. So every day people are coming together. Perfect examples, Pinetop Lakeside, like many communities, has a child care access issue. They recognize, even people that don't have kids recognize that that's an issue with building and sustaining a healthy Pinetop Lakeside community. So they brought stakeholders together to create a child care center, both for community and economic development reasons, to recruit and retain high quality workforce to that critical area of our state, but also meet a critical need of people. And I think that's one thing we learned from the election, right, is these kitchen table issues that really drive folks. Another issue we face in Arizona, and that will be an upcoming topic for Town Hall, is housing and workforce, right? The great folks at Vail in Southeast Arizona recognized that they weren't able to recruit and retain teachers in the Vail School District, a growing area just outside of Tucson. So the school district partnered in the community to build affordable housing, tiny houses for teachers so that they could live and work near the school communities that they were serving in. Or the good folks in the South County portion of Yuma County. During the pandemic, the South County portion of Yuma County was one of the hardest hit areas in the country because of the immigrants who come in and work the fields in Arizona of the salad bowl of America. There was no option to not work for a lot of different reasons. So the great folks at the Interagency Farm Worker Association, who have trusted community relationships, met the needs of those workers to ensure that they have the critical safety requirements they needed to continue to do that critical work that benefited our entire state so we can enjoy the great salads we have in our country. Those are people every day that come together, that tackle their toughest challenges, no matter of the divisiveness that we see in our politics. And I get to see that every day. So I'm glad that you ended on hope, Tara, because there is hope. There is a lot of negativity in the world, but as a native Arizonan, I'm so committed to working here in the state, and why I feel so privileged to work at Vitalyst and with our colleagues here to be able to recognize that there are great opportunities that are bringing our communities together. That's also being seen at the national level. So in my role, I get the great opportunity to build a lot of relationships with national funders. And again, as a national, as a native Arizonan, I'm so committed to bringing down those national dollars to the great things that are happening here in Arizona. And there's a great organization that I'm part of called the Trust for Civic Life that is actually moving national funds to support civic life throughout our state, especially in rural, small town America, tribal border communities. They also have a focus in the South and Central Appalachia, the flyover country, if you will, of forgotten America. And I'm proud that there are already collaboratives being funded from the National Trust for Civic Life. And the National Trust for Civic Life is this pooled national funds that is moving money to support local collaboratives that are building community, strengthening civic health in a lot of different ways. And I like to say that the capital T trust is building this lowercase t trust that Tara, you mentioned was so important and one of the learnings from the town hall. So there's both this place-based collaboratives, communities coming together every day, being matched with national resources. So there are a lot of great things happening to resource those things, but still a lot of systemic change that can happen that we're still involved in.
Okay, we got building up hope. So Christy, bring home the hope question.
All right, we'll build on it. Yeah, just building on some of the themes that have already come up, but a couple of areas of work that many of you are engaged in to share. The first is this idea of strengthening civic culture. So the kind of reaching out, reaching for understanding with curiosity, with empathy, relates to this idea that comes from a similar national effort, Our Common Purpose, which is out of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A national bipartisan commission has this great sweeping set of recommendations for democracy and civic renewal nationally. And one of their key pillars is this idea of strengthening civic culture. And the idea there is that we need more representative systems and elections and democratic processes, and we need more people engaged, and we need greater civic education, but that civic culture is actually really the foundation to be able to make any of that possible. And what that refers to is really just the kind of norms and habits and how we participate in our civic and public life. And Eric Liu, who's one of the national leaders in that work, has shared something that really kind of stuck with me, which is we have a civic culture, whether we like it or not. So it's either working in really positive, constructive ways toward that public problem solving and solution building, or it's not. So what are the ways that we can all be contributing towards the healthier, more constructive, more productive civic culture that we know is really needed to then feed all of these other areas that are needed. The Arizona We Want, CFA, is one of our contributions to that effort that we hope to engage all of you in of, how can we really create a new narrative together that really encourages, a stake in one another, a stake in our shared future as a state, that encourages using the idea of shared facts and shared knowledge and shared data to inform that vision. So really thinking about how do we kind of create that narrative and maybe counter narrative in our work together. Another thought that relates to that is work that we're doing through the Arizona Civic Life Partnership. We get to work with Town Hall and Vitalyst and so many of you in the room, and the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership at the Flynn Foundation as our lead partner in this. One of our recent projects has been the Arizona Civic Language Project. So if you don't yet have this at your table, I think they're out at the registration table. Another Spark brief, thank you, Vitalyst, that really digs into the language we use in democracy and civic work and whether or not that's landing with communities across the state. How are people receiving terms like democracy? Is it positive? Is it negative? Like civic engagement, like equity, like patriotism. And what we've learned is that there really are significant differences when you look at different communities, whether urban or rural, looking at education, that it really plays a role in how we're talking about and communicating about these issues in our community, and that language really does matter and play a role in whether we're able to connect and build bridges, or whether we're sort of causing kind of the shutdown and the lack of communication. So offer that as a resource, but also mention that because the Civic Life Partnership will be doing more work ahead to really build a collaborative of organizations who care about these issues and who are committed to using data to really set goals together. So we know kind of how we're doing in some of these issues of democracy and civic life, but where do we actually want to go as a state? And for all of us who are doing this work in the field, in communities, to be a part of that kind of vision setting and goal setting together. And then the last one, if I can have one more on a hopeful note, is on the theme of civic education. So this came up loud and clear, I think, in the town hall conversations. It's definitely been a theme in our research that Arizonans want greater civic education. So I do just want to mention one project called the School Participatory Budgeting Initiative that we're engaged in at CFA, but really just as an illustration of what this can look like. In that case, we're working with schools who engage students to actually make decisions over how to spend dollars to improve their school community. So they're coming up with ideas, they're building proposals, and they're holding a vote day. So the whole campus community gets to vote on where those dollars will go. We call it learning democracy by doing because they're really learning that hands-on problem-solving process. But I think what's actually even more important that's happening there is some of this culture building work. It's students actually seeing that it matters to show up, that they have a role to play, that change is possible. In this case, it's very meaningful, tangible change intentionally, and to inspire that sense of belonging and purpose that can then carry them into other areas of community and civic life. So finding ways collectively that we can be tapping into young people to be part of that change making right now, and also that I think has the most potential for transformative change for civic health in Arizona, to really position young people to be ready to lead and to feel like they have a role to play. So would encourage others to join us in that work as well.
Great. We'll have Tara to wrap it up, but I want to just emphasize that both David and Christy talked about potential solutions and actual solutions that are urban, rural. It doesn't matter. They apply across the board. So as you start working on your questions, as soon as Tara's done, you'll have an opportunity to put that down on paper. So Tara, you want to wrap it up for us?
You know, Bill Gates mentioned coming from the great state of Maricopa. And when I travel around the state, when I'm in the small rural areas, I certainly hear that all the time. The great state of Maricopa is the one running everything, and there's a lot of resentment to that. So I think it's only fair, since you asked about hope, to bring in an example of hope that came from Thatcher, Arizona, and Paul was with me. This was after spending a week in Mojave County, where really Lake Havasu City and Kingman were challenging, would be an understatement. We get to Thatcher, and there are, first of all, 2 electeds from the county there, and several self-described members of the Democratic Party. Who knew they exist in Thatcher? But and seriously, I was surprised. And what was wonderful and gives me hope is that they said, We don't care about that. And we want to work together as a community for our community because they know each other. And they talked about, gosh, get this, 2 different political parties working together to create a fair so that they could have civic education for their community, regardless of the party. And that is what gives me hope. It comes in those conversations where you're dealing with each other as people first, not party first. So that's one aspect of hope that I think is helpful. There's been a number of discussions about primaries and independents, and I mentioned the Spark report. In most conversations, there was consensus that we need to look at changes to the primaries. There was support for an open primary system. What I found was in an election year, if you were a member of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, you didn't want to support that, this is my interpretation, because it would take away your power. So that made it more challenging for this year, but overwhelmingly, especially for independents, once they understood, and for those civic leaders who really care about what's best for the state versus my party, overwhelming consensus that this is the type of systemic change that will not only inspire but keep good civic leaders. So that's another, I think, opportunity for hope for the future. There was a lot of opportunity to educate people about that and the need for that. And so maybe it's time will come. Other hope for me, I cannot wait to be going around the state on a topic that's not voting in elections. It is, whew. Our topic this year is workforce development, and David mentioned that. And here's the opportunity there. When you can get people together to talk about a topic where they're not viewing each other as different political parties or urban or rural, they have the opportunity to make those bridges and to see each other as people who can solve problems. So I know for me, I am just so looking forward to going to all these communities and having a conversation where I'm seeing the bridges being built across Republican, Democrat, independents, great state of Maricopa, and the rest of the state, because we are all in it together.
Right. Wow. Hand for our panelists. Okay, we're going to transition. So you've been hearing a lot this morning. You've had 2 panels that have, like I said, given you lots of food for thought. And we're going to have you have an opportunity to have a conversation about what will work in your areas, in your community, in your circles. So I'm going to hand this back to Greg.
So good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for being in a community college space. My name's Deanna Villanueva Salcedo, and I'm Associate Vice Chancellor with Maricopa Community Colleges. I welcome you onto our campus, and I'm really, really glad that we heard the comments we did about reviving civic life and civic education. For many that may not be aware, the fuller realization of democracy is core and central and foremost in the mission of community colleges nationwide. In fact, there was an infamous report from 1947 that led to the expansion of community colleges across the country. And it mentioned not just training for jobs, it mentioned not just training and education to transfer to a university, but it mentioned the restoration of civic life. So the fact that we have this room filled on a community college campus talking about the restoration of civic life makes my heart sing. So thank you all for being here and carving out some time for this discussion. Now is the time where we turn the program over to you. So you all have 2 questions. If you could ballpark 12-ish minutes for each, I know you will all have animated discussion, but we really want to capture your thoughts about the topics that have been discussed so far today. So 1, policy changes. So what kind of policy changes, and there's some examples there, that we could consider when we talk about improving voting in elections. And I will push you to be specific. This is not the time for what I call the Miss America answers. You've heard them, right? We want world peace. We want you to be specific. Really push yourselves into concrete thinking. So again, about 12-ish minutes, we'll have 1 recorder. If you're a table recorder, can you raise your hand? And for those where someone isn't raising a table, pick one amongst yourselves. The second, who is responsible or should be responsible for taking needed action? And this is again where I will push you to some specificity. If you've ever been involved in civic discussions, we talk about the infamous they. What they ought to do is I don't know who this they person is running around doing all the work that people talk about. But again, we're going to push you to be specific. Who is the they? And who are the responsible parties? Okay. We will have quick report out at the end. So I'm going to ballpark again 12-ish minutes for each question, and I'll kind of nudge you as we go along today. Does that sound like a good plan of action? All right, excellent. I wanted to get a response there. I'm going to go ahead and get you started. But for those of you who haven't already seen the I will cards, they're on, yes, people are saying yes now. They are on every table. They were attached to your packets. Encourage you to fill those out before we leave today. Your commitment, what you will do moving forward. Good to see you. So, question number 1. I have someone taking notes in the corner. Question number 1, greatest opportunities to improve voting in elections. Raise a hand. Anybody who would like to report out just 10 words or less, because we've got a lot of tables together. 10 words or less, what your table came up with for question 1.
Okay, thank you. So for opportunities to improve, oh, geez, you scared me. Sorry. More poll workers and to have some type of a pipeline, because the age of most of the poll workers, they're starting to kind of cycle out and we need more help. Go to your company, try to find out if they have any benefits or offers for volunteer work or hours.
Awesome. I'm going to take it to the next table. Round of applause for our first table. That was a very polite way of saying we need younger poll workers, I think. All right, Gila Monster, 10 words or less. Number 1.
10 words or less. Okay, so better structures for countering misinformation, inclusion of as many voters as possible in a nonpartisan way, changing to the current political party system and the control they have, encouraging diversity of information sources, especially with the youth.
Ooh, a round of applause for Table Gila Monster. Question number 1.
Yeah, so following up on that, we basically felt that the long game education is crucial, and the channels, and there needs to be younger people brought into it, and the traditional media and news sources is not going to flip the switch. We need to broaden it.
Awesome. Round of applause for Table Meerkat over here. Table, let's see. Roadrunner table. Question number 1.
The Roadrunners had 3 things. We thought that we needed better poll worker training, which might mean sort of uniform statewide training because it's done by county. Better civic education of all ages, not just of children, but of adults. And then open primaries.
All right. Very specific from Table Roadrunner. Round of applause.
I think we've hit on most of ours as well, going around the table, but one of them is really improving education for the voters and getting the word out there in the right venues so that you're reaching all the populations, whether it's social media or the traditional media, and really countering this fomented distrust that starts long before the election.
Ooh. Big round of applause for Table Rock Squirrel. Hand up was here.
All the above that everybody mentioned, but just some key points. One, when some of the areas were from rural areas, and one of the comments were poll workers, of course, younger, but also more education, and that we ensure there's a balance. In some of the rural areas, unfortunately, some of the poll workers, some parties are more stronger than some of the others, and that has been a difficult issue when they want to solve some things. And also consistency in policy, meaning that all all counties. Maricopa has its own policy on how they do voter reg, voter education, the type of language they use. The rural areas also have their different method of doing that, and that confuses a lot of people who have relatives in other parts of the state and also the county area. Then have a whole bunch of listings.
Awesome. Let's round of applause for table Elf Owl. Consistency of policy. Last one for question 1, and then we're going to move to question 2.
Greetings, everybody. We're the Bobcats. Okay. Woo woo. Okay. Acknowledgement of differences in rural and urban areas, education and helping to get people to vote in local ballot measures, focus on getting better voter turnout in local elections, different transplants coming to Arizona. So helping them to provide local information once they arrive. Ballot language may need to improve to help people understand what they are voting for.
Good one. All right, round of applause for table Bobcat. So question number 2, this is another one where we're pushing for specificity. None of the anonymous they, what they ought to do. If I ever catch this they, I'll be in trouble. So who is responsible for taking or should be responsible for taking needed actions? Who wants to weigh in on this one? Ooh.
Basically all of us. But specific. But also giving people the courage to call out people in their own communities where they have relationships with people, they're already trusted to some degree, having the courage to call people out when they're doing the wrong stuff.
Round of applause for table Bighorn. Question number 2.
So I agree. We have to talk about going beyond voting. It's about holding your elected officials accountable. At our table, we discussed having already relationships. Sometimes you have donated to these campaigns. You may consider these individuals your friends, and I do that too. But at the same time, I'm holding the ACEs accountable. I am going to call, text, and put it on public record to let them know that this is not the will of the people. And ultimately, we have to hold leadership accountable to ourselves as well as community. If we want them to hear our voices, we have to know the various channels and ways that we can communicate with them. And that's about civic education. It's about understanding the process, knowing about the request to speak system, and being able to give public testimony at public meeting. Thanks.
Awesome. Round of applause for table Hummingbird. The minute you said elected officials, you got a shout out from the back of the room.
All right. The javelinas, who are not pigs, by the way. There's a few groups. We have the everyone needs to step up with some courage. But more specifically, we talked about journalists, local and national, to be asking the tough questions, to counteract the demise of the local town paper where those just don't really exist anymore. Political party leaders, especially those in the minority. Teachers, and there are free resources like Civics 101, there's a way to do that. And then nonprofits need to step up and even donate to civic education.
Round of applause for the javelina. Thank you for the clarification on species. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we also talked about how individuals need to step up, make sure that you're sharing information on elections with your friends, family, having conversations with people with different perspectives of you than you, making sure to engage in civic dialogue, and then also holding our elected leaders accountable, for not only their specific policy measures, but that they are doing the voter outreach that they need to be doing.
Let's get a round of applause for table Pronghorn. Other want to weigh in on this question of the who?
So we have the Miss America answer of all of us. But our table is really facing that a lot of these groups are disincentivized for whatever reason. Politicians don't want to lose voters. Businesses don't want to lose their clients and their customers. Individuals might feel threatened. So until we have open primaries where we really change the incentive structure, it's going to be hard to empower these different groups.
Round of applause for table Meerkat. Talk about incentives for behavior. Speaking of which, behaviors, I'm going to ask for a very specific behavior at the moment. We have about 4 minutes before we break for lunch. And as they roll in the tables and get things set up, If you wouldn't mind the note taker putting your notes right in the middle, I'll come and collect those. Those will be compiled and you'll get a report out right after lunch. So if you could have those accessible, I'll pick those up. And then if you could also fill out these I will cards. And this is really that personal commitment. What do you commit to doing once you leave this room? What do you commit to doing in regards to everything that you've heard so far today? Yes.
Can you share one answer, our one answer?
Yes.
Please, I know you're, just because it partnered on it, but we had a really good conversation that stemmed from something that was said earlier, that we thought community colleges were very important and that civics should really be a requirement, even if it's 1 credit hour, because the difference there is most people that go to the community college are still living at home and they're in their community and connected to the local community.
She had to slip community college in there. Did you notice that? I love that answer. Round of applause, round of applause. All right, so if you could move to leave your items in the middle, especially the I will and the notes, we'll come and pick those up and then we'll get a brief break before we move to the lunch program. Thank you, everyone.
Isn't it magic? Hello, everyone. Welcome to our lunch program. Most of you, I think, were here earlier this morning. I'm just going to make sure I move to where I'm the camera for those online. If you weren't, I'm Tara Jackson, president of Arizona Town Hall. And everything we do at Arizona Town Hall is in collaboration with other groups or organizations. This started, well, I guess it's probably in our DNA based on how we were as an organization from its founding, a little bit before I was born, but not much. But it also is because I know when I came on board as president of Arizona Town Hall, what I heard over and over again in every conversation is that there needs to be more collaboration. People need to work together more. And if you've ever tried to do that, it can be a challenge, right? It can be a challenge. But we took on that challenge. And so every program we do, we strive to have 1, if not 10, collaborating partners. If you look through our different community town hall reports, you will see that whether we are partnering with community colleges like today, universities, chambers of commerce, civic organizations, we do that across the state, and today is no exception. There are many organizations and others we're partnering with. But the organization we're partnering with who's bringing you this lunch program is Leadership Now Arizona. And I'm really glad that we can be here, and I'm going to turn it over to them in just a little bit. But before I do, I want to talk briefly about this morning and your audience discussions. I had a number of you already ask, well, what happens from all these discussions, from all those pieces of paper that you gathered? Here's what we'll do. We will go through all those reports. We will look for consensus, key points that we think everyone might agree with, or just the most important points. We will bring those together and we will publish them. If you already filled out, I can tell we have overachievers in the room. If you already filled out your I will card, we will also list all the different I will statements as part of that report. Not with your name, just the statements, because they help inspire people. To get back to Evelyn's comment earlier during our panel, you know, where do we have the hope? Where do we move forward? The I will statements are a way of inspiring people on how they can be a part of moving solutions forward. Because we all know what happens when you say they need to do something. That's the best way to not get anything done, as opposed to how do we all take responsibility for that. So I want to give you a sample because we have a wonderful recorder who's online. You didn't get to meet her today, but I know she's listening, Mary Greer. And she has already taken and created a consensus for her group. We'll combine this with some other groups, but I just want to read you out an idea of how we get our statements. This is what Mary's group online discussed in answer to the first question. This is the only one I'll read in total. Civics education is critically important. There should be state funding of nonpartisan civic education through cities and/or counties. This education should not focus just on elections, but also include the basic structures of government. Too many people vote based on party affiliation, and too many independents don't vote in primaries. This should be addressed in civic education. Some people will not absorb information presented in civics education programs. They mistrust government and people outside their group. We need to find a better way to teach them on an emotional or psychological level to overcome barriers to learning. It will be important to find a source of funding for this effort. In the classroom setting, for every $50 spent on STEM education, we could spend only 5 cents on civics education. We should reassess these priorities. Younger generations have not had the same experience of voting in elections that older generations recall fondly. We need to engage younger people in the community's civic life and do our best to replicate the good experiences that older generations have had around elections and voting. The school participatory budgeting initiative allows students to have a hands-on experience of civic engagement, including being able to register people to vote. Students as young as 16 can serve as poll workers. We also need to address misinformation. Social media, including Reddit and TikTok, are a major source of news for younger generations, and it has allowed misinformation to spread. So that gives you a feel. What an amazing group, right? I know you had great discussions here as well. Before I turn it over to our lunchtime program, because it is about hope and what we can do, I'm just going to read a few of the I will cards that we've already collected about what many of you have already committed to. I will approach my neighbors with more curiosity, listen, and don't judge. I will continue to share and communicate what I have learned from Arizona Town Hall and from other forums. I will continue to vote, promote civic education at my college, with my family and community. I will help bring more civic education to my community, including how to hold elected officials accountable. I will commit to share the information I learned in my social media channels to help inform the people that follow me. I will work to build trust and increase dialogue with people I disagree. There's a big one. I will continue to educate my communities, encourage courageous leadership and accountability. And there are many more just like that. But now, on to our lunch program. So hosting our lunch program is John Fees, a longtime member of Arizona Town Hall, who was desperately searching for his Town Hall rosette this morning, for those of you who have that. He's an Arizona native, a serial entrepreneur and CEO. He's also co-founder of Leadership Now Arizona, a group of business and community leaders who stand for a strong democracy in the state. Leadership Now Arizona supports safe, secure, and accurate elections, stands against extremism, and champions reform that enhance democracy for all Arizonans. And he's got a more detailed bio as well in the handout, so I certainly would refer you to that. And John will be in conversation with Elizabeth Newman, who I've just met today, but I feel like I know her because I just listened to her book, which I would recommend. And her book is called, it has a colon after it, so that, yeah, Kingdom of Rage. That's the part I remember. Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. And I know from listening to her book, she is a self-identified Christian and has some fascinating insights, not only from that perspective, but also from serving as Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Deputy Chief of Staff in the first Trump administration, along with many other roles that you can find in her bio. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John and Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Well, Tara's correct. My first Arizona Town Hall was 1987. Pat Norris, I think, was the recorder in the session, which is hard to believe. Barry Aarons, who spoke earlier, was in the session with me. I was, at the time, Shirley Agnos was very, very kind. She included the student leaders, I think 2 from each university. And I'm not quite certain how I got to be a student leader, but I was there representing ASU. And it really changed my life in terms of meeting people. One of those people is Suzanne Feaster, who's on the CEO of the Vitalyst Foundation. Suzanne and I met in line for food. I had no idea who her dad was at the time. Many of us were mentored by Jack. You know, and it's been a long ride before I get to this conversation, because I look at myself and Adam starting Leadership Now as part of a national effort of people that have been on the sidelines. I was much more involved 30 years ago than I am today, although today my wife would disagree. I've been busy raising 5 kids, running a couple of national businesses. I didn't join GPL. I don't join a lot of things in Phoenix. I do one thing primarily, and that's raise my kids and run my businesses. I support people like Jack Sellers and Rusty and old friends from college that are running for office. But I've kind of been on the sideline, and I realized with Leadership Now, it's time to really become involved, to get back and start not volunteering for my kids' things, but being here in these kind of conversations and these dialogues. We can no longer afford to be indifferent. And the great thing about Elizabeth's work is she comes at it from a security point of view. And I think that's really an important angle. We think about our communities as being safe and secure, but they're unstable right now, and it's being led by our adversaries. And the disunity that we feel, the remedies we are seeking, are being constantly undermined by adversaries who want and seek to divide us. And I really believe that we miss that, and social media enables it in a way that never in human life has that been possible. So Elizabeth is going to help us unpack some of those issues. And I'm sorry for my kind of personal bio, but it really matters as to why most of you don't know me, but why we're starting to show up now. And Pat, you can make me feel guilty for not being back here for a while. So, Elizabeth, we had a great conversation beforehand. Elizabeth's a University of Texas grad, now lives in Texas, is raising 2 children up there as well. What's that? Denver. I'm sorry about that. And she's really an expert on polarization. She's written a book that we can all benefit from. But since the election, I've been thinking about how do we really get here? And you're kind of an expert in terms of the pathways towards this radicalization. And right now, 90% of Americans say political polarization is a threat. Yet, about 40% of us think the other opposing party is downright evil. Those two things do coexist. Both of those things coexist. Elizabeth, you wrote a book about Kingdom of Rage. I'd love to hear your thoughts on exactly that.
Yeah, one of the things I learned in my own research, and maybe I start there. I spent 20 years trying to defend and build the apparatuses to protect our country from another 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001. I was very young. I was working in the George W. Bush administration, and it was devastating. And I said I would do whatever I could to make sure that we didn't have to go through such a horrible day again. And look, we did a lot of good things. Some other things, different conversation that should have been done differently. But we prevented another 9/11. So good for us. But around 2017, I'm back in government, working in the Trump administration, and the counterterrorism community is grappling with the fact that globally we had more terrorists, and it's true even today, more terrorists today than we did on 9/11. We're not winning. So I have all of these great tools, military intelligence, law enforcement, but the threat was metastasizing. And by that point, it was becoming clear that the threat was not just from overseas, from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda, it was domestic too, which arguably we've always had that, yes. But the counterterrorism community finally woke up to it. And I think there are a lot of people out there that have done some really rich research into the why, the cognitive bias that we have. But some of it was just 9/11 was catastrophic in a way that there was the political will to pour a ton of money into fighting that fight. And the other fights are, kind of, they bubble up and they go back down. But there was this moment with the spate of attacks in Charlottesville. You have the protests, and you have like neo-Nazis not even hiding their face. And I don't know about you, but I just had this moment of like, what? This happens here. And of course, for those in the Jewish community or in the Black community, and as we later came to see the Hispanic community, they would tell you, yeah, it's always been here. But it wasn't so public as it was in that moment. And then we had the Tree of Life synagogue attack. We had Christchurch, a moment when the whole globe is like, oh, this is now a global threat, this white supremacist threat. And we, the United States, were largely exporting it. And then you go into El Paso, and I could just keep going, Buffalo. One of the things that shifted what was largely a white supremacist threat, now globally, this is not just in the United States, it's, yes, that's still there, but increasingly we're seeing more violence coming from what we call anti-government or anti-institutionalism. Now, historically, that has largely been the most lethal, I should say, the most lethal threats have come from what we consider the far right. But the far left threat has always been there. If you go back to the 1960s and 70s, that anti-institutionalism actually goes back to the 1900s. It's been there. It just hasn't been as lethal, and it kind of died down. And now what we're seeing globally is it's all coming up, both sides. There's been a survey that's been taken every year since about 2017, asking Americans what their tolerance level was for violence in the name of achieving your political aim. And since 2017, it's been ticking up. And actually, people that ascribe to a left politics tend to be a little bit higher in that survey, saying that they're open to violence as a solution to their problem. And we saw that in particular in 2024, the numbers were quite high. Now, in practical matters, if you're in my field, I'm looking at where the actual violence occurs, because I want to reduce loss of life. That's my first priority. And then I want to reduce other crimes against property, against disrupting life and the economy. That tends to be where the left focuses, and the right tends to, unfortunately, be responsible for more loss of life. But the concern is that the entire trend line is upward and upward in an exponential way. And it hasn't quite come down yet. Now, some of the attacks aren't as, we haven't seen as many of the big ones, but I will also tell you that we still see a lot that are unsuccessful or smaller numbers, and we're desensitized to it, so the media doesn't tell us about it. So when you actually look at the data every year after year, the plots are still there. The attacks are still happening. We're getting a little bit better at detecting and disrupting. And so you don't hear about it as much. But I would tell you, we have a problem with violence in this country. Huge problem. 32% of Americans believe that violence is sometimes or usually justified to achieve their political agenda. That is 84 million people. Anybody have any idea how many law enforcement we have in the country? 800,000. We cannot law enforcement ourselves out of this problem, because look, 99% of those are not going to go do anything. We know that. We know that about how our belief systems work, that we can be cognitively open to something, but we're never actually going to do it. But we don't know how to figure out who is the person that's going to go do it and do it right now. It would be amazing if we could ever figure that out, but human beings are complex, and a lot of it is context driven and environmental. So when I look at the problem set and go, how do we reduce violence? The answer is I've got to reduce the pool from which the violence comes. And the pool of 84 million is simply too large. And when you work upstream like that, it turns out that the tools of government aren't that great. You can't use law enforcement to reduce the sentiment that violence is justified. You have to be using other tools, civil society, us in this room saying, no, it's not acceptable to use violence to address our grievances.
It's a great example. And the grievance theme is something I really see even in the workplace. Each of you that run organizations, you can see when your employees are upset. You can see it in our families when grievance at a Thanksgiving table emerges. And this has been confirmed by Edelman's research, which Edelman's a internationally respected brand house and public relations entity that really evaluates the brands we trust and the institutions we trust. And I think it's pretty well known in this room that institutions are under attack everywhere. You could go back to the Catholic Church and its problems, but now government's widely mistrusted. All of our institutions, elections are mistrusted. Let me just give you the data, and I'd like to see what Elizabeth thinks about this. The Trust Barometer is called. Who do you trust? Do you trust your insurance companies to pay your claims? I'm in the insurance business. Now, if you're in California, you don't right now. I mean, I was with some of the CEOs of the largest insurance companies just 2 weeks ago. They're wondering what can we do to improve trust and confidence in the insurance world. It's all about trust and confidence. I said, how about advertise what percentage of your insurance you paid, what claims you pay? It's a simple thing, right? Do you do what you promise? And the challenge for CEOs is that what we're saying is Edelman has said that with a low trust environment, this high grievance culture emerges, and it's called hostile activism. In fact, the percentage of people who believe political violence is what you just said is just growing rapidly. What can we do to help reduce grievance and the grievance culture that happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the trend lines that the community, the security community that I come from, we actually are starting to move away from using the term violent extremism and using the term grievance-based violence, because we're having more and more perpetrators who have such mixed ideologies or you can't pinpoint the ideology, that it's better to describe it just as people who are either very angry and upset about something, or just kind of in a place of despair, nihilism. The first Trump assassination attempt, the shooter, the young man, kind of falls in that category of nihilism and despair. The attacker that attacked the CEO of United Healthcare it falls into both categories. There's a grievance there that he wasn't specifically targeting United Healthcare as much as the whole system, right? So you have that anti-institutionalism also, and just a young man in despair, sees no point to life anymore. We have increasingly in our youth this sense of despair and nihilism. So you, as a field, what we've been grappling with is we used to think of things in terms of people get recruited into groups and they get some blend of narrative and ideology from that, and out of that they mobilize to violence. And it's increasingly less about finding belonging in a physical, in real life group, and more just consuming narratives that they see online that fuel that grievance, fuel that hate. I think the concern I have is that the way that somebody becomes open to whether it's a organized extremist group or these messages online of here's the solution to your problems and it involves violence, is because something in their life has gone wrong and they don't have protective factors that allow them to address those challenges in a healthier manner. And the vulnerability there, I would argue, we've always had moments in our life where we experience challenges or go through a trial or suffering, and it's just that we had stronger belonging, we had stronger things in life that we could find meaning and purpose in, and that societally is becoming harder to do. But we also don't trust that those institutions that were at some points protective factors will actually be able to deliver on the things that they said that they were going to deliver on. So there's an intertwinedness of, as you lose trust and faith in some of the core things that make our society work, you're starting to see societies not working. And if you don't have strong attachments to something else, usually a strong relationship with another, hopefully healthy person, it is very easy to become susceptible to these messages online, mostly online, that it's all broken. There's nowhere to go. You might as well burn it all down, go out in a blaze of glory. And it just reeks of despair. It reeks of there's no point anymore. And when we were studying this, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, post 9/11, that yes, there's despair there, but it was also a fight of ideas. And this isn't a fight of ideas anymore for those that are going down that pathway of violence. They're not killing for the sake of what they perceive to be some greater purpose. They're killing because they think it's all broken. And so somewhere in the midst of that lack of trust, and obviously, I mean, extremism, violence is only one outcome here. I mean, we can look at drug abuse, drug addiction, deaths. I mean, that whole deaths of despair model. There's a whole host of negative outcomes that are coming from a society that's fundamentally not working the way it used to. And in order for us to solve this problem, we kind of have to get back to the basics. We have to start recovering. Why does it matter to have the government system that we do? Why does it matter to be involved in your community?
Yeah, we have some great assets here in Arizona. Yeah, my wife and I, Arizona natives. Her family's been here since the 1780s. Intermarried from Mexican and Native communities. Grew up in Mesa. I grew up in Tempe. We both met at ASU. We spent 8 years away. Came back. Michael Crow and brought, thankfully, Sybil. And the state all of a sudden had these other assets. Arizona Town Hall's coming along, still around. I think I called you, Tara, right when I got back. Said, how can I help? That was before my next 3 kids. Sybil, your work is profoundly important. Those of you that are not following the Center for the Future of Arizona, started by Laddie Kaur, and really now emboldened by Sybil's work, is doing some of the most meaningful work to say, what do we want? All right, what can we agree on? How do we move forward together on some key things? Arizona Town Hall is a unique thing. There's nothing like it in Massachusetts. Most states don't have anything like it. So these dialogues that are happening, and Tara, your willingness to go across the state to visit matters. When I think about Arizona's unique assets to overcome grievance and build some connective tissue, I think of immigration because most of us depend on immigrants in some part of our lives. Absolutely. Most of us were immigrants, right, as well. And in education, which I'm deeply involved with in terms of the attainment agenda in Arizona, there's a consensus. It's more than 95% of Arizonans that we surveyed this last year agree that access to high quality education should be independent of your zip code. Right? That's not how we fund schools, right? Independent of your zip code. Right now, this week, 7 national education statistics just were published. It said 7 out of 10 fourth graders do not read proficiently. You can argue with the data, right? But as Adam Goodman, my friend back there, said, but those that can come from families that look very different than those that might be in the tribal or rural Arizona right now, tribal lands especially, or that are in an immigrant household. So it's very hard to build consensus when you can't read. Very hard to change the attainment curve in the state if you can't read. So we have to look at some of these fundamental things. How do we think of these topics like immigration being a factor in grievance culture and in blaming somebody else for where we're at today?
So scapegoating the other is a core feature of extremism. And I would argue that scapegoating the immigrant is kind of like millennia, multiple millennia old. We, in our field, we say anti-Semitism is the original form of hate, and hate of the immigrant kind of comes second if you go back in history. So it is a well-worn way for people to usually manipulate a population to get things the way that they want them to be. So what you often see is a dynamic of maybe the maybe the economy's not going well, or maybe there was some other external challenge, and a leader or a politician, not necessarily the ones in power, it can be anybody trying to obtain power, uses that fear and that grievance and blames somebody else for all of our challenges. And by doing so, they consolidate power, they win power, they elevate themselves. So it's largely a manipulation tactic. That said, I think the last couple of years, we have been on the receiving end of what is likely to continue in terms of a mass migration from global south to global north. That is not unique to the Western Hemisphere. Europe is challenged with this too. We have it's a whole host of reasons driving the mass migration, including states that are not stable, economy, post-pandemic economy in particular, and climate change are just a few of the reasons why people are seeking a better life. So from a security standpoint, what I want to know is I want to know who you are when you're coming across. I want to know what your purpose is and that you don't have nefarious, malicious intent. And I want to know that you haven't done anything in your past that would indicate you might have malicious intent, right? So if you committed a serious crime elsewhere, then yeah, that's probably not somebody I want coming and living in my neighborhood. That's what the laws of the United States currently say. And they actually have a whole host of other tests that you can apply as well. And that's why we have so much discretion from administration to administration of who gets to come in. But I sit on the board of the National Immigration Forum. I am very pro-immigration. I think we can do it lawfully and securely. I don't think security is the reason you can't do immigration. I think security has been abused as a cudgel, if you will, for why we can't let people in. That said, we've had a lot of people come in the last couple of years. And I think we need to recognize that we have not competently welcomed them in a orderly way. There are certain communities, Denver is one of them, that disproportionately received a whole lot of people, and it has led to challenges in just existing infrastructure of how we care for new people. The way that the laws are structured do not allow somebody that's here on asylum for the first 6 months to work. It doesn't make sense. Like, these are people that want to work. And so now they're kind of operating either with a government handout or outside the bounds of lawful employment activity. So some of these things, it's a systematic problem. It's not the individual that's the problem, it's the system that's broken. And for 25 years now, we have been trying to do some form of immigration reform, and it never passes. And there's a point at which it doesn't matter if the security officials are jumping up and down saying we need reform. It doesn't matter if immigration advocates are saying we need reform. It doesn't matter if the folks that would prefer less immigration jump up and down and say we need reform. It never happens. And you start to wonder why, and you start to realize, well, maybe it's because the politicians don't want to fix it, because they actually win elections using immigrants as their punching bag. I would.
It's a money machine.
It
right?
is.
Yeah.
It is. I would love to see, though, the reforms that would pass in this Congress would likely be more strict than I would personally prefer on a policy standpoint. But we do need to do something. Like the men and women of my old Department of Homeland Security, are put in an impossible position. We're not resourcing them properly. We're not giving them the personnel that they need to do their job effectively. We hamstring them from a whole host of different ways, and they just the rules keep changing on them. You're supposed to do it this way, now you're not. And it's not right to ask of our public servants, to basically be the punching bag of the politicians. So I personally would love to see some reform here. I would love for us to be able to actually have a debate about it. Yeah. Do you ever notice that we never actually get into the details of what needs to be reformed? You're either open borders or you're anti-immigrant. You're like, what if none of us are any of those things? It's
Well,
just,
in
yeah.
Arizona, John McCain and Jeff Flake and others lost their seats were largely because of their votes on these things. John McCain did not lose a seat, but he was vilified. And, if you think back to some of the candidates that vilified him, it's largely his votes on these things. And so we've lived through it with some people with some real courage. They've lost their seats for it. What I find so useful about Elizabeth's language is security matters. And let me add the Leadership Now perspective, which is the economy matters and jobs matter. We spend a third of our lives working in some organization. The leaders of our organizations really do matter, and what they care about and what they lean into cares about. Right now in Phoenix, Adam and I and a few other CEOs that are in the room are stepping in and basically saying, we need to step up. You can't be indifferent. If you look right now, the state has over 200 publicly traded companies. Those publicly traded company CEOs don't say anything, virtually any of them, about defending Stephen Ricker when he's called at a Republican meeting to be lynched. They don't say anything. They work for public companies. They don't want to say anything. They just want to deliver their jobs. My belief is workforce. Why does education matter? Why does a stable democracy matter? Why does security matter? Because our lives depend on the economy and how it's functioning. And while there are people that want to disrupt this, I like to point it out, it really does matter to tie it back to, we need to find a way to live in harmony, even when we disagree. I did not want the Eagles to win, right? But a lot of people in my office wanted them to win, including my chief operating officer. So I tolerated it, right? I tolerate it. It's like, and I can live with it. But I will say during COVID, what I saw with my friends, especially, is my friends who watched ESPN every night lost that for 8 weeks. They lost it. And they all of a sudden turned into MSNBC or Fox News fans. And their sport energy moved to politics. And my brother, this is particularly true. He cares more about his politics and what he's being fed on the news now than he does his sports teams. And he got out of the habit of watching ESPN. And now that sounds silly. That's my little note. But that same thing happened in our religion, in our church. We happen to be active in a community. Some of our community members from St. Thomas are all here. And it's an interesting thing because some of the people that we go to church with take their politics more seriously than their religion. And also then bring that politics back into the religion. And you see that in terms of, oh, you can't vote for that person, or you have that sticker on your car. And this is just a drop-offs, right? And, Jack, I have so much respect for you and the courage you've had, and Bill Gates earlier being on the county board of supervisors, because your safety was at risk. You were personally threatened, like Stephen and others. And I have so much respect for you being in the arena. We need to have a new story for that. And we need to have a new story for our heroes, being Rusty Bowers and Jack and Bill Gates and Stephen Ricker. How do we tell that as a new story? And how do we connect it either to security or well-being in the economy? I think narrative is one of the most important things we can do in our society. And coming out of this, telling a different story and framing it is essential, I think. So what are your thoughts?
I love that. And I agree with you that everything is about story. It's the story that we believe that is how we position ourselves and how we engage in the world and what we're open to, right? And there are a lot of stories right now from the, past 10, 15 years of going back to the institutions, that all the ways the institutions have failed us, all of the ways that you have suffered because of that. And you have bad actors who take those grievances and then they weave a story. That's what ideology is, of the other, some scapegoat. And sometimes the other is, the politicians use it. It's the elites on the coast. It's the media. It's the deep state and government. But inevitably, some of that narrative eventually gets translated into, it's not just an us and them. It's not just an existential crisis. This is the most consequential election of our lifetime. Your success or survival is dependent upon your side winning. That's what an extremist narrative how it starts. The way it ends is it says, I have a solution for you. The solution is violence. The solution is hostile action. hostile action being on a spectrum. There's some non-criminal stuff, harassment, threats, bullying, which is largely what you all endured. But in my definition of extremism, that's extremism. Might not be violent extremism, but it's still extremism because somebody has made the decision that the way to address their fears or their concerns is to bully and harass and threaten and intimidate people. And then some small percentage move up to the violence part. Maybe it's property damage, maybe it's some form of graffiti that's basically hate speech, and then maybe eventually it's harming somebody. And if we want to stop the violence, we got to deal with all of the non-criminal stuff, we civil society, because government can't do that, right? We need as a society to say it is unacceptable to harass somebody just because you don't agree with them on their policy or their stance. It is unacceptable to intimidate somebody, whether it's online or offline. We have to take that stand. So the narrative that we have to weave is that, one, this is no longer acceptable. And I do think COVID changed this. All of these trends were in place and got amplified by COVID. But part of what really broke with COVID is we all kind of had this almost mental breakdown, and you watched people do things that they never would have done before, right? Yelling at the McDonald's person or the Starbucks person or the airline attendant, so much so that corporations are having to put up signs saying, hey, you can't treat my employees this way. We're not going to let you back in if you keep doing this. Like never before in my life have I had to see a sign. No, that's not true. At TSA, they had to put up signs long ago, but not for the rest of society, right? So we broke. We haven't made a collective effort to try to get back to where we were. Now, I don't mean like we can never be like the before times, but we as a society can say, this is unacceptable behavior. We can raise our children that way. We can confront other adults when they act inappropriately and do it kindly and respectfully, but say this crossed a line. And this is where I think businesses could really help, right? Because businesses can, as kind of non-government entities, reset what is acceptable behavior. And those of us that are in public service, that are serving on school boards, or perhaps just the person that goes to the school board meeting pretty frequently, when somebody steps out of that norm of civil behavior, you confront that person and say, hey, you seemed really upset, and I would love to hear more about this, but we really need to treat those that are serving our community with more respect. And like, we have to start stepping out and holding each other accountable in a loving, kind, empathetic way, but firmly. And I think once we have more people stepping out and confronting that behavior, what you find with a bully is that the bully backs down. So, but how do we tell that story? This is where I have met some new people in the creative arts industry in Hollywood. Oh my gosh, telling a good story, that is not my talent, but we do need new stories. We need new heroes. And we need to cast that vision for people, that there is a better way for us to look forward to something in our communities and in our nation by being that kind of hero.
Yeah, I think the grievance cultures told the narrative around the other side, right? Here are the heroes from January 6th or all these other things. And what I kind of try to do with the business community is try to identify, how do we recognize the everyday heroes that we have, but then building empathy through stories. Some of you know, we're at a great community college system. Phoenix is one of the great Maricopa County community colleges, are outstanding, but there is a great program called the Storytelling Institute at South Mountain Community College that Liz Warren started for 30 years. And that is one special place. Arizona Republic hosts 3 storytelling events. You want to build empathy? Listen to your neighbors' stories. My wife's involved with this, and I've gone to these events, and I really wonder, how do we build empathy? And I've asked that question a lot as an action item with how do we build some insight into our neighbors and what's going on? David Hines, one of my friends, he runs Arizona Interscholastic Association. There are 800,000 high school students. 300,000 participate in an AIA sport. Many of you have gone to them. By the way, sports includes forensics. It includes a lot of other things, electronic games, a lot of things that involve young people. You want to know, go to when a community really supports itself. When you go to Phoenix games, go to Perry High School right now, it's packed, right? They've got one of the best high school basketball teams in the state. They all vote for different people. Maybe not all at Perry, but they all vote at different people. They vote for different people in the stands. They go to different churches, but they cheer for that team. David told me though, during COVID, right, these rural communities especially did not want to wear masks to the games. And now we know we probably didn't need masks outside maybe as much as we did, but they wouldn't send officials unless they followed the rules. And guess what? You had towns all over the state that showed up to root for their team with masks on. Because we really do want to pull for our communities. And I have some hope and some real optimism. We want to pull for a team, right? We're uniquely, we identify with things. We do need an identity. And I think that our challenge here in part is to find that positive identity. And so when I think of stories, the to do for me is to think about what is that positive identity that you can be a hero like Jack and Bill Gates and Stephen Ricker and Rusty Bowers and these people that defended our elections. And a hero like you. Elizabeth, you know, I read your bio as I worked for the Bush White House, worked for the Trump administration, led a campaign to support Biden in 2020. You have courage. And so I'd like to kind of conclude with a thought about courage. Tara and others spoke about it earlier today. What can we do to demonstrate and encourage the courage we need to see in our communities? What do you recommend?
I think it's really hard when the last few years have been so difficult in our relationships in a way that it just wasn't 10 years ago. And yet what I want to encourage all of us is that there is a moment, a sweet spot, if you will, right now, where at least for those who are on the right side of the political spectrum, their narratives that they're consuming in their media is not telling them to be scared. Why does that matter? Because when you're in a fear place, a place of here are all the reasons why things are going bad and why you're being threatened, you have that fight or flight hormone kick in, and you can't be open, you can't be curious, it's hard to persuade somebody when they're stuck in a place of fear. And when I talk about that 84 million that are open to violence, now's the time to take the portion of them that come from the right side of the spectrum. We'll talk about the left in a second. On the right side of the spectrum, to appeal to them and appeal to them from a place of empathy, from a place of curiosity, to say, like, last couple of years have been hard. I really care about you. I want to understand what's going on in your life. What led you to a place of being maybe so scared, depending on how well you know them, and persuade them back to that civil norm of, we have some similar values. We might disagree on our solution sets, but we share common values here of wanting the best for our community, and start to rebuild that relationship. The relationship is the protective factor, right? Your relationship, being that experience of being loved for who you really are, is such a strong protective factor. It will build the resilience to the next set of messages that come that says, the only solution is violence. So now's the time to work, even though it might be hard from the past 4 years or past 10 years even, now's the time to do the courageous thing and take the step out and let that person know that might be in your life that you still love them, that you care about them, you'd like to learn more about where they are and how you can be in relationship with them. On the left side, if you have somebody in your life who, and by the way, when I'm using the terms left and right, I'm not talking about people who are not open to violence. I'm talking about the people who you may have encountered that start to say some scary things when the politics gets intense, that, yeah, maybe I do need to go join the militia, or maybe I do need to, take up arms. Nothing wrong with having a gun, but when you're sitting there going, I need to do it because I might need to go do something, that's when I get concerned, right? So on the left, hey, those narratives are now back to the sky is falling, we're going to lose our democracy, and they're in a place of fear. So it's harder for them to be open to the messages of moderation, of peace. But what you can encourage is that we still have tools, legitimate ways in which we address our grievances, and it doesn't have to resort to violence. It certainly doesn't have to resort to harassment or bullying or all of those things. Now, that can be harder depending on where they are and what's going on in their life. What we find with people that mobilize to violence is it's yes, the environmental factors matter, but usually it's something else is going on in their life personally that's getting them to that place that they think violence is an option. So being in their life, being present, being willing to listen to their fears and not judge them, that's super powerful too. Again, it's the relationship and it's the being accepted for where they are that really matters and can anchor people even when they're going through a difficult time. And the reason I'm answering your courage question that way is that is hard work.
It is.
It is really hard because you end up sometimes getting attacked, blowback. It's not necessarily rewarding relationship all the time.
The most
but it's so
courage
needed.
required is the people we love, right? It takes a lot of courage to be honest. It does. So, Marion, do we have questions? One or two. Okay. All right. These are good questions. I'm going to try to go through it. History tells us, Barry Aaron's would appreciate any history reference, that civil society is an important guardrail in moments like these. What examples have you seen or the lack of those or lack of those in the last few weeks since the new administration's been in?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I agree. Civil society, hugely important. I was going to take the answer to that question to Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone book, which is proven to not only have been accurate at the time, but really prophetic, that we are just increasingly a more isolated society. There was a Surgeon General's warning last year that was pointing to data that shows like we spend significantly less time with other human beings outside of our household now than we did even 10 years ago. We're just very, very alone. So there's the isolation component, but that also means that there are less people involved in civil society. And I was so inspired by what you said, John, about wanting to re-engage and get off the sidelines. This sounds kind of weird because I'm sitting up here speaking, but I've been feeling the same, like that I have done most of my work in Washington, D.C. at a national level. And all of my pull right now is we've got to be local. I've got to be invested in my local community. We recently moved to Denver, so I'm working on that. I don't have deep roots yet. But that's I think where we need to be investing is locally and getting people off of the national. So the question was, what's happening right now in Washington? Hey, there are people with jobs that are being impacted by what's happening in Washington, D.C. And I would never be one to say that you should not be aware of what's going on, but I would strongly encourage you to limit your consumption, because what happens here in the state of Arizona or in Phoenix or Maricopa County impacts your life way more than anything happening in Washington, D.C. So go local, stay focused on building relationships locally and investing in your local community. Eventually, if we did that in enough cities enough states in this nation, we could fix Washington. But I'm absolutely convinced that we can't fix Washington from within Washington. I think it's going to have to come from out here.
Absolutely. By the way, Phoenix, besides Arizona Town Hall being unique, I think, and besides it being a swing state, what people may not realize when you leave the state or you're out of Arizona for a while, you start to realize Arizona is one of these markets. It's a test bed for ideas. And if you were going to launch a product and you're Frito-Lay, this is one of the places you do it. It looks like America. It's got a lot of immigrants. This is where you test market ideas. It's no accident that you also have three very active, politically charged organizations, Goldwater Institute being one of them, Alliance Defending Freedom, which you may or may not know, but it's the inverse of the ACLU, basically. And I'm friendly with people on all of those boards. And Turning Point USA, I'm not friendly with them. But
They like young people.
I sadly say that, you know, a lot of my son's friends are very active in that group. And so those three organizations are here in Phoenix, right? You can meet those people at church, in your grocery store, and other places. There's nothing wrong with that, but we need to engage them. We need to have conversations. What puts you in those rooms? How do you have those conversations? And I think we need to have those, because as good as all the work you're doing, Sybil, and all the good work Arizona State and Maricopa Community College is doing, and Arizona Town Hall's doing, we need to realize that our neighbors are also voting for different people and believing different things. And we need to understand, how did they get there? I will say one other thing with Adam Goodman in the room, because he's the chair of the Arizona Center for Investigative Journalism. We also are living in a reality collapse, and people are not entitled to their own facts, even though that's what's happening with social media. Elizabeth and I talked earlier, when Facebook started, I met Mark Zuckerberg in April of 2004. He had 7 schools. One of the most dangerous platforms in the world, in my opinion. Most of us don't understand it. Then TikTok comes along. We do not understand what's just happened. These entities are more powerful than the printing press, and they're moving more rapidly because of the cell phone than most of us understand. So when you think about civil dialogue and stories and narratives, you can't think about it without that dimension. And I share that because right now, the Arizona Republic has the lowest reader subscription in its history. It's, I think, paid subscriptions around 135,000. Sybil's doing great work on launching new initiatives. And Nikki Carroll, the former editor of the Arizona Republic, is launching new initiatives, because if you live in Lakeside or you live in Prescott, you don't have access to complete news necessarily. And our work is also to bring that news. The research Arizona Town Hall does, powerful, objective, but not enough people read it. And the only good news is, if you don't like what the Arizona Republic wrote yesterday, don't worry, not enough people read it to matter. Right? So if they don't endorse it, don't worry about that, because we have got to find our own ways to publish. And I really think one of the things we need to do is my to-do is bring attention to your work. I think your work, the way you did you have credibility because you've been in the arena, but your framing of these topics is a really useful way, whether it be immigration, security, and polarization. Elizabeth, this is a treat that you'd come down. So. Any other questions from the audience or online? Tara? Yes, go ahead, Marin. My favorite name. My first daughter is named Marin. So.
I'm really glad you mentioned social media, because you're right, most people don't understand how it works. I have recently removed myself from social media, so that it becomes more of a challenge to stay engaged with what is going on both with my community and with people. That's the main. But the thing that hasn't been addressed in this room yet is the algorithms, and the fact that it's not a free, fair, open marketplace for ideas on social media. It's not a marketplace of ideas. It's designed. It's like the nicotine in cigarettes, right? It's designed to keep you addicted, and the way you get addicted is outrage. So when you talk about stories and narrative, I'd really love to hear about some ways that, as individuals, other than just getting off, which has been my form of doing it, how you address that sort of thing, especially.
Well, we both have children. We were talking about, I live with 3 teenagers, so TikTok is their world. But the good news is they send me things, and I get to send them things. So I don't really have an answer, but I believe they need to be regulated. I don't believe there's willpower. The largest U.S. shareholder in TikTok is a very good friend of mine. Happened to be the largest contributor to the Trump campaign. It's do I disagree with them? Yes. Do they want it to be regulated? No. I absolutely believe they lose their ability to be free from regulation because of the algorithm. The algorithm is what leans them into a commercial enterprise that requires regulation. So to me, that's one of the top issues in the country, but no candidate's talking about it. Yeah.
I would agree with that. On the kids front, I'll share, my kids are a little bit younger than John's, and some of the research started to come out when my kids were young enough that I could start to just lay the groundwork. you ain't getting a phone until this age, and you're not getting on social media until you're 16. And I now have an 8th grader and a 5th grader, and it is real now. And their friends have things that they don't. But the evidence base is really coming out and saying, especially for girls, this is extremely harmful to their development. And so I just have to explain it in that context. Sorry, mom knows too much. And no parent would ever want to intentionally cause harm to their child. And that's just kind of how it is for me. So we have lots of conversation. I have to work extra hard to make sure that my kids are connected still to their friends. It's not an easy way. Jonathan Haidt calls it a collective action problem. But you look for other like-minded parents or communities. And I do think my kids are Generation Alpha, not Gen Z. And I do think that Gen Alpha parents have the benefit of learning from Gen Z and maybe making some changes. But I do think we need a society-wide conversation about how our cell phones are affecting our kids. And I'm not anti-tech. I work for a tech company, but like what you find is, and you probably know this, most people that work in Silicon Valley don't let their kids have as much access as the rest of America does. And there's a reason for that. So we need to be having that dialogue and looking for reasonable ways to protect our kids, just like we protect our kids from drugs and alcohol and all the other stuff.
Great question, Maren.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was good stuff. Worth the time alone. Thank you to the moderators and the panels who preceded you, and thanks to all of you for being here and participating. Tara told me to announce that Celine, I think it's Olivas from the Secretary of State's office, is here. If you want information, any of you, Celine has it all, I guess, I'm told. I don't know exactly what it is. Oh, they can't see me? Okay. Sorry about that, people. So Celine is here if you need information from her. We are not going to read any more I will cards right now, but we will happily collect I will cards if you didn't get a chance to fill one out. They're on the tables, and please fill it out, and you can just leave it on the table and we'll pick that up. Those make it into the report that is then published, circulated. I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you again to the sponsors. Whoever organized that lunch, that was fantastic. I enjoyed it. Thomas R. Brown Foundations, Vitalyst Health Foundation, Leadership Now in Arizona, Gateway Community College is a fantastic place, and Maricopa Community Colleges. I think we have covered the business. So thank you for coming, and have a good rest of the day.